Hey guys, tonight we begin with the daily grind of a Napoleonic soldier. Endless marching, bad boots, watery soup, and the constant threat of frostbite or cannon fire. Basically, the worst group tour through Europe you could imagine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from across the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine waking before dawn, not to birdsong or a soft alarm, but to the sharp bark of orders, the smell of old leather, and the ache of damp straw under your back. You're a soldier in Napoleon's Grande Armée, and your day begins long before the sun ever breaks the horizon. The rhythm of your life is boots on dirt, the scratch of coarse wool against your neck, and a bowl of something that may have once been soup, eaten quickly before the march begins again. And then the marching begins. Napoleon's army was known for its speed, but that speed came at a cost. Day after day, you would trudge more than 30 kilometers, with a musket slung over your shoulder, a knapsack cutting into your spine, and boots that seemed to wear thinner with each step. The soles were often made of wood and thin leather, hardly suited for rocky alpine trails or frozen Polish roads. Blisters turned into open wounds, wounds turned into infections. But the column never stopped. If you fell behind, you didn't just get scolded, you disappeared. The pace was relentless. While other armies of Europe might cover 10 or 15 kilometers in a day, Napoleon's forces moved like a machine, driven by an invisible engine. The Grande Armée could appear where enemies least expected, striking before generals even knew they were under threat. But this tactical advantage came from the legs and lungs of common soldiers who paid the price in flesh and bone. Your pack contained everything you owned in the world. A spare shirt, perhaps, if you were fortunate. A needle and thread for mending. A small pouch of salt. A tin cup that doubled as a bowl. Sometimes a prayer book, though many soldiers learned to read the terrain better than scripture. The weight of it all, combined with your musket, cartridge box, and bayonet, could reach 40 pounds. 40 pounds that grew heavier with each passing hour, each uphill climb, each river crossing, where the water soaked through your boots and never seemed to dry. The musket itself was a weapon of contradictions. The Charleville model, the backbone of Napoleon's infantry, was accurate enough at close range, but became nearly useless beyond 100 meters. It was a single-shot weapon that required a practiced hand to load quickly under pressure. You carried paper cartridges filled with black powder and a lead ball, but in rain or humid conditions, the powder could become useless. A wet cartridge meant a misfire, and a misfire in battle could mean death. Your uniform, that symbol of military pride, was practical rather than comfortable. The blue coat was made of coarse wool that scratched and chafed, especially when wet. The white trousers showed every stain, every splash of mud, every drop of blood. The tall black shako hat, adorned with its brass plate and plume, looked impressive on parade, but offered little protection from sun or rain. In winter campaigns, many soldiers discarded regulation headgear for whatever warmth they could find, creating armies that looked more like bands of brigands than the disciplined force that had conquered half of Europe. There were no rest days, not really. When the army paused, it was only to forage, clean weapons, or fortify camp. That meant digging trenches, collecting firewood, or, if you were lucky, trading with local villagers for something better than hard bread and salted meat. Rest meant work of a different kind. Maintaining equipment, washing clothes in whatever water could be found, writing letters home if you could write, and if you had paper. The daily ration, when it arrived, was a study in survival rather than sustenance. A pound of bread, often baked days earlier and hard as stone by the time it reached your hands. 4 ounces of meat, usually salt pork or beef that had traveled in barrels for weeks, a measure of dried beans or rice, sometimes vegetables, though these were luxuries that appeared irregularly and disappeared quickly. Wine or brandy, when available, served as much for morale as for nutrition. But most nights, dinner was a crust of black bread and perhaps a few ounces of meat that had traveled too long in the bottom of the sack. If you were in Spain or Russia, you might be lucky enough to boil some potatoes. If you were deep into a long campaign, you might eat horse. Horse meat became so common during the Russian campaign that veterans would later joke about it, though the humor was dark and born of necessity rather than choice. Foraging became an art form. Soldiers learned to identify edible plants, to spot farmhouses that might yield eggs or milk, to negotiate with locals who spoke languages they didn't understand. The ability to supplement official rations often meant the difference between strength and weakness, between marching another day and falling by the wayside. Some became expert at finding beehives, others at catching fish from streams. The lucky few might trade buttons or small personal items for fresh bread or cheese. Water was perhaps more precious than food, clean water anyway. Soldiers drank from streams that had been fouled by thousands of men and horses. They filled their canteens from wells that had been contaminated by the passage of armies. Dysentery was as common as morning drill, and it killed more soldiers than enemy bullets. The fortunate ones recovered after days of weakness and dehydration. The unlucky ones simply couldn't keep up with the column's pace and were left behind. Sleep came in snatches. If you weren't on sentry duty, you might curl up in your cloak under the stars, trying not to breathe in too much of the smoky chill from the nearest campfire. In winter, the ground froze beneath you. In summer, the mosquitoes didn't care if you were a conscript from Burgundy or a general's aide. They bit just the same. Night brought its own terrors. The sounds of an army at rest were never truly peaceful. Somewhere, a man coughed with the deep, rattling sound of lung fever. Another moaned in his sleep, reliving the day's battle or dreaming of home. Sentries called out passwords in the darkness. Horses nickered and stomped. And always, there was the possibility that dawn would bring orders to move again, to break camp before the sun rose, to begin another day of marching toward an uncertain destination. The cold was a particular enemy. In the mountains of Spain or the plains of Poland, winter meant more than discomfort. It meant death. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Hypothermia took the weak and the wounded. Soldiers learned to share body heat, to build shelters from whatever materials they could find, to keep fires burning through the night even when fuel was scarce. But fires also attracted enemy attention, and the choice between warmth and safety was a constant calculation. Disease spread through the ranks like wildfire. Typhus, carried by lice that infested every uniform, every blanket, every piece of equipment. Smallpox, which could blind or kill. Scurvy, when fresh food became impossible to find. The Army's medical corps was skilled but overwhelmed. Field hospitals were often nothing more than tents or abandoned buildings where the wounded lay on straw, tended by overworked surgeons who did what they could with limited supplies. Personal hygiene became a luxury. Soldiers might go weeks without a proper bath, cleaning themselves with whatever water they could spare from drinking. Lice were constant companions, along with fleas and other parasites. Uniforms rotted from sweat and wear. Boots fell apart and were replaced with whatever could be found or improvised. The image of the smartly dressed soldier existed only in paintings and parades, not in the reality of campaign life. And always, in the distance, there was the sound of drums, or hooves, or thunder that might not be thunder at all. Battle was a frequent visitor. The approach of combat could be felt before it was seen. Orders passed down through the ranks with unusual urgency. Officers checked their watches more frequently. The pace of the march would change, sometimes accelerating, sometimes slowing, as the army deployed from column into line. The moments before battle were filled with ritual and preparation. Soldiers checked their weapons, ensuring flints were sharp and powder dry. They might say prayers or write hasty letters to families they might never see again. Some vomited from fear or excitement. Others fell into a strange calm, as if accepting whatever fate awaited them. Veterans shared what wisdom they could with new recruits. Their experience was often the only teacher that mattered, but it wasn't glorious. Not for the rank and file. You didn't charge into the fray with polished armor or stirring music. You stood in a line, shoulder to shoulder, holding your musket steady, waiting for the command. The reality of Napoleonic warfare was one of disciplined formations, precise timing, and collective action rather than individual heroism. Formation fighting required absolute trust in the men beside you. The line had to hold, no matter what approached. If one man broke and ran, others might follow, and a collapse could spread through an entire regiment in minutes. So you stood your ground, even when cavalry thundered toward you with sabers flashing. Even when artillery shells exploded nearby, showering you with dirt and debris. Even when the enemy's muskets flashed in unison and the air filled with flying lead. Then you fired in volleys, watching smoke fill the air until you couldn't see the enemy. The coordinated discharge of hundreds of muskets created a wall of smoke that obscured the battlefield. You fired not at individual targets, but at the general area where the enemy was supposed to be. Loading was done by drill and instinct. Muscle memory developed through endless practice. Then came the reload, powder, ball, ramrod, again and again. The process had to be automatic because there was no time to think. Bite the paper cartridge, pour the powder down the barrel, ram the ball home, prime the pan, cock the hammer, present arms, fire, and again, until your shoulder ached from the musket's recoil, until your ears rang from the constant explosions, until your hands were black with powder residue. The mathematics of musket warfare were brutal. A trained soldier could fire perhaps 3 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. In the chaos of battle, surrounded by smoke and noise, the rate dropped significantly, and the accuracy was poor. Most shots missed their intended targets. Victory came not from precision, but from volume, from the ability to maintain disciplined fire longer than the enemy could. And if the enemy got too close, you fixed bayonets and prepared to meet them in the clamor. The bayonet charge was both the most terrifying and most decisive moment of infantry combat. It was a collision of flesh and steel, where training and courage mattered less than desperation and luck. Most bayonet charges ended before actual contact, with one side breaking and running rather than meeting the steel. But when they did meet, the result was carnage. The sound was deafening. The smell, a heavy mix of sulfur, sweat, and blood, clung to the air. Gunpowder smoke burned the throat and stung the eyes. The metallic scent of blood mixed with the acrid smell of burning cloth and hair. And underneath it all, the human sounds of pain and fear, of men calling for their mothers or their gods as they lay wounded on the field. Artillery added its own dimension of horror. Cannonballs could decapitate a man or take off limbs. Grapeshot turned cannons into giant shotguns, spraying metal fragments across wide areas. The psychological effect was as important as the physical damage. The screaming sound of incoming shells, the earth-shaking explosions, the sight of comrades simply disappearing in clouds of smoke and debris, all combined to test the limits of human endurance. And still, you pushed forward, not because you were brave, necessarily, but because everyone else was moving. Stopping meant dying. The momentum of battle carried men forward even when their minds screamed at them to flee. The training, the discipline, the presence of officers and sergeants all combined to keep the formation moving. Fear of cowardice could be stronger than fear of death. Cavalry charges added another layer of terror. The sight of mounted men thundering toward your line, sabers raised, was enough to break many formations. The key was discipline and timing. Infantry formed squares, presenting a hedge of bayonets in all directions. If the square held, horses would not charge into the steel points. If it broke, the cavalry would cut down fleeing men like wheat before the scythe. The wounded and dying were everywhere. Men who had been laughing and joking an hour earlier now lay screaming in agony or silent in death. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones lingered, calling for water or for their comrades to end their suffering. Medical attention was limited, and the priority was always the men who could be saved and returned to duty. And when the battle was done, when the ground was littered with the fallen and the wounded cried out across the fields, you didn't rest. You scavenged. The aftermath of battle was a grim marketplace where the living stripped the dead of anything useful. Weapons, ammunition, boots, coins, food, all were fair game. It was not cruelty, but necessity. The dead had no use for their possessions, and the living needed everything they could find. You patched your uniform with cloth torn from enemy coats. You helped bury friends, or you walked away, too tired to care. The burial details were hastily organized affairs. Mass graves were the norm, with little ceremony or individual recognition. The pressure to move on, to continue the campaign, meant that the dead were quickly covered and forgotten. Only the living mattered now. The psychological toll was immense. Men who had been farmers or shopkeepers before the war now walked among corpses as if they were stones in a field. They learned to sleep despite the moans of the wounded. They ate their rations while sitting on ground soaked with blood. They developed a callousness that was necessary for survival, but came at the cost of their humanity. Some broke under the strain. They would sit staring at nothing, unresponsive to orders or threats. Others became brutal, finding release in violence that went beyond military necessity. Still others retreated into themselves, going through the motions of soldiering while their minds wandered to distant homes and peaceful times that seemed like dreams from another world. Medical help was limited. A wound could mean gangrene. An infection could mean amputation. The surgeon's tools were few. A saw, a rag to bite, and perhaps some brandy to dull the edge. But again, there was no time to mourn or recover. The march resumed. Field surgery was performed without anesthesia, often by candlelight or torchlight. The screams of the patients could be heard throughout the camp. Amputation was common and usually fatal. Even when the surgery was successful, infection often followed. Gangrene was a death sentence. The smell of rotting flesh became as familiar as the smell of gunpowder. Men learned to recognize the signs of mortal wounds, to know when a comrade was beyond help. The acceptance of death became as necessary as the acceptance of orders. The medical corps did what they could with limited resources. Surgeons worked tirelessly, often collapsing from exhaustion. They developed techniques for rapid amputation, for treating gunshot wounds, for dealing with the massive casualties that followed every major battle. But for every man they saved, several others died from wounds that would be treatable in later centuries. Pain was constant, not just from wounds, but from the daily grind of military life. Feet that were raw and bleeding from endless marching. Backs that ached from carrying heavy packs. Shoulders worn raw by musket straps. And always the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more of the same, or worse. Yet there were moments of unexpected tenderness. Soldiers sharing their last piece of bread with a wounded comrade. Veterans teaching new recruits how to survive. Men writing letters for illiterate friends. These small acts of humanity survived even in the midst of industrial killing, proving that the human spirit could endure even under the most brutal conditions. And yet, despite it all, there was a strange pride, a strange rhythm to it all. You are part of something bigger, something legendary. The Grande Armée was not just another army, but a revolutionary force that had changed the nature of warfare itself. It moved faster, struck harder, and recovered more quickly than any military force in European history. The soldiers knew they were making history. They saw the fear in enemy eyes, the respect in civilian faces, the awe in the reports of foreign observers. They were part of a military machine that had humbled Austria, crushed Prussia, and sent the other powers of Europe scrambling for safety. This knowledge provided a pride that sustained them through the worst hardships. You were a piece in Napoleon's grand design, a living part of a military machine that had never been seen before in Europe. The emperor had created something new, an army that combined the revolutionary fervor of the French Republic with the discipline and the organization of the old royal armies. It was a force that could appear anywhere, strike with devastating effect, and disappear before the enemy could respond. The tactics were revolutionary. Instead of the rigid linear formations of the past, Napoleon's armies used columns that could move quickly and deploy into line when needed. Artillery was concentrated for maximum effect rather than spread evenly along the front. Cavalry was used for reconnaissance, pursuit, and shock action. The combined arms approach meant that infantry, artillery, and cavalry worked together as a single organism. You knew the emperor's face, even if you'd only glimpsed him once. Napoleon made it a point to be seen by his soldiers. He would ride along the lines before battle, speaking to the men, sharing their hardships, demonstrating that he was not just a distant commander, but a leader who understood their sacrifice. His presence was electric, transforming tired and dispirited men into enthusiastic fighters. You heard the way officers talked about him, with reverence, with fear, with absolute loyalty. Napoleon had promoted many of them from the ranks, rewarding merit rather than birth. They knew that their emperor understood war, not from books, but from experience, that his orders came from tactical genius rather than aristocratic privilege. This confidence filtered down through the ranks, creating an army that believed in its leadership. You saw the way he inspired silence when he passed by, not the fearful silence of oppression, but the respectful quiet of men in the presence of greatness. Soldiers would stand straighter, hold their weapons more precisely, present themselves as worthy representatives of the force that bore his name. The emperor's approval was worth more than gold, his disapproval more feared than enemy fire. He wasn't just a man. He was the future, the revolution made flesh. Napoleon embodied the promise that merit could triumph over birth, that talent could overcome tradition, that France could dominate Europe not through royal lineage, but through revolutionary energy. He was proof that the old order could be overthrown and replaced with something better. The emperor's proclamations were read to the troops before major battles. They spoke of glory, of destiny, of the soldier's role in creating a new Europe. These words were not empty rhetoric, but statements of belief that resonated with men who had lived through the revolution, who had seen the old world crumble and the new one rise from its ashes. And so, you kept marching. From Italy to Prussia, from Spain to Russia, through forests, over mountains, across rivers. The campaigns blurred together in a continuous stream of movement and combat. Italy, where the young general first made his reputation. Egypt, where he sought to emulate Alexander. Austria, where he shattered the combined armies of the old coalition. Prussia, where he demonstrated that reputation alone could not stand against revolutionary warfare. The geography of Europe became as familiar as the streets of your home village. The Alps crossed in impossible conditions. The Danube forded under enemy fire. The Vistula crossed in the dead of winter. The Niemen that marked the beginning of the Russian adventure. Each river, each mountain pass, each battlefield became part of the collective memory of the Grande Armée. The days blurred together. The letters home grew fewer. Sometimes the news from France stopped coming altogether. The outside world became increasingly distant and irrelevant. What mattered was the next meal, the next march, the next battle. The army became a world unto itself, complete with its own customs, its own language, its own understanding of what was important. Friendships formed quickly and deeply. Men who shared the same hardships, the same dangers, the same fears, developed bonds that were stronger than family ties. They looked out for each other, shared their rations, covered each other's weaknesses. When a man fell, his comrades mourned genuinely and briefly before moving on. There was no time for extended grief, but the memory of fallen friends was carried forward like a sacred trust. The rhythm of campaign life became natural. Wake before dawn. Check equipment. Eat whatever was available. Form up for the march. Walk for hours through whatever terrain lay ahead. Set up camp. Eat again. Sleep. Repeat. The monotony was broken by battles, by river crossings, by the occasional rest in a captured city. But always, the underlying pattern remained the same. But still, you followed the eagle. The golden eagle that topped each regiment's standard was more than a symbol. It was a talisman, a focus for loyalty, a representation of everything the soldiers fought for. To lose the eagle was the ultimate disgrace. To defend it was the highest honor. The eagle connected each soldier to the emperor, to the army, to the cause that had brought them so far from home. Even when the snow came, the Russian winter of 1812 tested every soldier's endurance. Men froze to death while marching. Others lost fingers and toes to frostbite. The retreat from Moscow became a nightmare of cold, hunger, and despair. But even then, the eagles were saved, carried by men who had lost everything else but refused to abandon their symbols of honor. Even when your fingers turned blue, frostbite was a constant threat during winter campaigns. Men learned to recognize the signs, to massage circulation back into numb extremities, to share warmth with their comrades. But the cold was relentless, and many soldiers paid with permanent disability for their service to the emperor. Even when your boots gave out, the retreat from Russia was marked by the sight of men marching barefoot through snow and ice, leaving bloody footprints that marked the path of the Grande Armée's dissolution. But they marched on, driven by discipline, by loyalty, by the simple desire to return home alive. The disasters did not break the Army's spirit immediately. Veterans who had survived multiple campaigns retained their pride even in defeat. They blamed circumstances, weather, bad luck, anything except their emperor or their cause. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility died hard, sustained by memories of previous victories and hope for future redemption. Communication with home became increasingly difficult as campaigns stretched across greater distances and longer periods. Letters took weeks or months to reach their destinations, if they arrived at all. Many soldiers learned of births, deaths, and marriages long after the events had occurred. Some discovered that their families had given them up for dead, that their wives had remarried, that their children had forgotten their faces. The psychological impact of this isolation was profound, creating a sense of detachment from civilian life that made the army even more central to their identity. The languages of Europe became a constant challenge. Orders had to be translated and retranslated as the army moved from German-speaking regions to Italian, provinces to Polish territories. Local dialects complicated matters further. A soldier might learn enough Spanish to buy bread, enough German to ask directions, enough Russian to plead for mercy. But true communication remained elusive, creating barriers that made the army feel like foreigners wherever they went. Local populations reacted to the Grande Armée with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and hostility. In some regions, especially early in the campaigns, French soldiers were welcomed as liberators bringing revolutionary ideals. In others, they were seen as invaders and occupiers. The relationship between army and civilians was always complex, shaped by politics, religion, and the harsh realities of military occupation. Requisitioning supplies from local populations was a constant source of tension. The army's needs were enormous, and local resources were often inadequate. Soldiers were forced to take what they needed, sometimes by force, sometimes through negotiation. This created resentment that could explode into guerrilla warfare, as happened in Spain and later in Russia. The line between legitimate military requisition and simple theft was often blurred. The Spanish campaign introduced a new kind of warfare that the Grande Armée was ill-equipped to handle. Guerrilla fighters struck at supply lines, ambushed isolated detachments, and melted away into the countryside before regular forces could respond. This invisible enemy created a constant state of tension and paranoia. Soldiers never knew if the next village would offer food and shelter or an ambush. The psychological strain was enormous, and casualties mounted not from pitched battles, but from 1,000 small encounters. Women followed the army, though their presence was officially discouraged. Some were wives who refused to be separated from their husbands. Others were camp followers who provided essential services, washing clothes, cooking, nursing the wounded, and offering companionship. These women faced the same hardships as the soldiers, often with less protection and fewer resources. They marched alongside the men, shared their dangers, and sometimes fought with desperate courage when the army was threatened. The cantonnières, official female sutlers, became legendary figures within the army. They sold food, drink, and small luxuries to soldiers who could afford them. More importantly, they provided a connection to civilian life, a reminder that the world contained more than violence and deprivation. These women are often tougher than the men they served, having survived multiple campaigns and earned the respect of hardened veterans. Children were born to these relationships, creating a generation that knew no home except the army. These camp children grew up among soldiers, learning to march before they could properly walk, becoming accustomed to the sounds of war as other children might grow familiar with lullabies. They served as messengers, helped with camp duties, and sometimes picked up weapons when the army was threatened. Their presence added another layer of complexity to military life, creating responsibilities that extended beyond simple survival. The hierarchy within the army was complex and often brutal. Officers could be promoted from the ranks, but the social divisions remained sharp. A sergeant might have more practical knowledge than a lieutenant, but the lieutenant's word was law. Corporals and sergeants served as the crucial link between officers and men, responsible for maintaining discipline and ensuring that orders were carried out. Their position was often thankless, requiring them to be harsh with men who had been their equals just weeks or months before. Punishment in the army was swift and severe. Flogging was common for minor offenses. Desertion could result in execution, though this was often commuted to decimation, where every 10th man in a unit was shot as an example to the others. The threat of punishment was constant, but it was balanced by the promise of reward. Bravery in battle could lead to promotion, to the Legion of Honor, to pensions and recognition that would last a lifetime. The veterans developed their own culture, separate from both civilian society and the newer recruits. They had their own slang, their own customs, their own understanding of what was important. A veteran could spot a new recruit from across a camp, not just by his clean uniform, but by the way he held himself, the way he responded to orders, the way he ate his rations. The learning curve was steep, and those who failed to adapt quickly often didn't survive their first campaign. Superstitions flourished in an environment where death was random and survival often seemed to depend on luck more than skill. Soldiers carried lucky charms, performed rituals before battle, and developed elaborate beliefs about what actions would bring good or bad fortune. These superstitions provided a sense of control in situations where control was largely illusory, helping men cope with the randomness of warfare. The army's relationship with religion was complex. Many soldiers retained their faith, finding comfort in prayer and religious observance. Others lost their belief in a benevolent God after witnessing the horrors of war. The presence of chaplains was inconsistent. and religious services were often hurried affairs conducted between marches or battles. Yet faith persisted, even if it was transformed by the experience of war. Music played a crucial role in maintaining morale and unit cohesion. Regimental bands provided martial music for marches and battles, but they also offered entertainment during quiet moments. Soldiers sang traditional songs, composed new ones, and used music to express feelings that words alone could not convey. The sound of familiar melodies could transport men back to their homes, provide comfort in dark moments, and create bonds that transcended language barriers. The Grande Armée's intelligence network was sophisticated but imperfect. Scouts and spies provided information about enemy movements, but this intelligence was often incomplete or outdated by the time it reached the common soldiers. Men marched toward battles without knowing the strength of their opponents, the terrain they would fight on, or the likelihood of success. This uncertainty created additional stress, as soldiers had to prepare for any eventuality while knowing nothing about what they might face. The aftermath of victory was often as challenging as the battle itself. Captured cities had to be occupied and controlled. Prisoners had to be guarded and fed. Wounded enemies had to be treated alongside French casualties. The administrative burden was enormous, and it fell largely on soldiers who were already exhausted from fighting. Victory celebrations were brief, as the army had to prepare for the next campaign, the next battle, the next test of endurance. Defeat brought its own set of challenges. Retreats were often more deadly than advances, as discipline broke down and men abandoned their equipment in the rush to escape. The wounded were sometimes left behind, as the army could not afford to slow its pace. Supplies were abandoned or destroyed to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The psychological impact of defeat was devastating, as men who had believed in their invincibility were forced to confront their mortality. The concept of home became increasingly abstract as campaigns stretched on. Letters from family described a world that seemed increasingly foreign and distant. The France that soldiers remembered was often different from the France that actually existed, changed by war, politics, and the passage of time. Some veterans found, when they finally returned, that they no longer fit into civilian society, that their experiences had changed them in ways that made normal life impossible. The economic impact of military service was significant. Soldiers' pay was often irregular, and their families at home struggled to survive without their primary breadwinner. The promised pensions and rewards were sometimes delayed or reduced by bureaucratic inefficiency. Veterans who survived their service often found themselves disabled and unable to work, dependent on a state that was more concerned with current military needs than with the welfare of former soldiers. The technological limitations of the era meant that warfare was intensely personal. Unlike later conflicts where enemies might kill each other from great distances, Napoleonic warfare often brought men face to face with their opponents. You could see the fear in an enemy's eyes, hear his last words, smell his blood. This intimacy made the psychological impact of killing more intense and the bonds between comrades more precious. Weather was always a factor, but it became a decisive element in some campaigns. The Russian winter of 1812 killed more soldiers than all the battles of the campaign combined. But even ordinary weather could be challenging. Rain turned roads into quagmires, making movement difficult and supply impossible. Snow concealed obstacles and made navigation treacherous. Heat caused exhaustion and increased the risk of disease. Wind could scatter musket smoke, affecting visibility and tactics. The Grande Armée's legacy was complicated. It had spread revolutionary ideals across Europe, but it had also brought war, destruction, and suffering. It had demonstrated the power of merit-based promotion and citizen soldiers, but it had also shown the terrible cost of military ambition. The soldiers who served in its ranks were both heroes and victims, creators and destroyers, liberators and conquerors. And as we leave this part of our story behind, let the sounds of boots in mud and drums in the fog fade into the distance. Because while the common soldier bore the weight of empire on their shoulders, one man walked ahead of them all, his name echoing louder with each campaign. The man who had taken these farmers and shopkeepers, these clerks and laborers, and forged them into the most formidable military force Europe had ever seen. The man whose genius for war was matched only by his genius for inspiring ordinary people to extraordinary sacrifice. Let's step back now and trace his rise. From a rocky island in the Mediterranean to the golden throne of an empire. From artillery officer to emperor. From provincial nobody to the master of Europe. Because to understand the soldiers who followed him, we must first understand the man who led them across a continent whose vision of glory demanded such terrible sacrifice, whose name would echo through history long after the last veteran of the Grande Armée had returned to dust. Before the parades and the portraits, before the grand halls of empire and the thunder of cannons, there was a boy. A quiet, observant boy, born on the island of Corsica in 1769, just a year after the island had been sold to France by the Republic of Genoa. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and his early world was one of tension, tradition, and foreign rule. Corsica was proud and rugged, shaped by mountain winds and family honor. The island had known many masters. Greeks, Romans, Pisans, Genoese had all claimed it, but the Corsicans had never truly bent their necks to any of them. They were a people of vendetta and village loyalty, where blood feuds could span generations and where a man's word was his bond. The landscape itself seemed to breed independence. Granite peaks pierced the sky, and ancient chestnut forests sheltered rebels who had learned to fight from behind every rock and tree. Into this world of fierce pride and ancient grudges, Napoleon was born to a family caught between worlds. The Bonapartes were minor nobility, with little money but a long name that stretched back through generations of local magistrates and minor officials. They owned some land, kept some servants, and maintained the pretense of gentility even when the coffers ran low. Napoleon's father, Carlo, was a man of ambition and calculation. He had initially supported Pasquale Paoli, the Corsican independence leader who had tried to establish a democratic republic on the island. But when Paoli's cause was lost and French rule became inevitable, Carlo made a choice that would shape his son's entire life. He switched sides. Carlo Bonaparte was a pragmatist who understood that Corsican loyalty, if properly managed, could earn a place in the broader French system. He courted French officials, learned French customs, and positioned himself as a bridge between the conquered island and its new masters. His reward was access to French education for his children, a prize beyond the reach of most Corsican families. He made sure his children would be educated in France, believing that integration, rather than resistance, offered the path to advancement. At 9 years old, Napoleon left home and never truly returned. The boy who boarded the ship to mainland France was still Napoleon Bonaparte, speaking French with a thick Corsican accent and carrying the proud bearing of his island heritage. But the man who would emerge from French schools would be something else entirely, a hybrid creature belonging fully to neither world. He entered military school in Brienne, a chilly and aristocratic place where his accent marked him as an outsider. The school was a monument to French military tradition, its halls lined with portraits of generals, and its courtyards echoing with the sounds of drill and ceremony. Most of his classmates were the sons of French nobility, young men who had been born into privilege and expected to inherit their father's estates and titles. They spoke with the refined accents of Paris and Versailles, knew the latest fashions and court gossip, and moved through the world with the easy confidence of those who had never questioned their place in it. Napoleon was different. He was teased for his Corsican roots, for his modest clothes, for the strange, clipped way he spoke French. His classmates called him the Little Corsican and mocked his pronunciation of his own name. Some suspected his family's recent conversion to French loyalty, whispering that he was the son of a turncoat who had betrayed the cause of Corsican independence. The young Napoleon felt every slight, catalogued every insult, and learned the bitter lesson that outsiders must work twice as hard to earn half the respect. But he buried the bitterness. He studied. He read books on mathematics, science, and war with an intensity that impressed even his teachers. While other boys played games or gossiped about girls, Napoleon haunted the library, devouring histories of great campaigns and biographies of legendary commanders. His heroes were Caesar, Alexander, and Frederick the Great. He read Plutarch's Lives until he could recite passages from memory, and he studied the military campaigns of antiquity with the dedication of a scholar preparing for examination. Mathematics came easily to him, and he excelled at the precise calculations required for artillery. He understood trajectories and angles, how to position cannon for maximum effect, how to calculate the amount of powder needed for different ranges. But his interests extended far beyond technical matters. He read philosophy, history, and literature. He devoured Rousseau's Social Contract and Voltaire's histories, absorbing the ideas that would later shape his approach to governance. He studied the rise and fall of empires, looking for patterns and principles that might guide his own ambitions. Alone much of the time, he developed a quiet intensity that stayed with him the rest of his life. He was not friendless, but he was selective in his associations. He preferred the company of books to most people, and he learned to find satisfaction in solitude. His teachers noted his intelligence, but also his aloofness, his tendency to stand apart from his classmates and observe rather than participate. Some saw arrogance in his bearing. Others recognized the defensive stance of a young man who had learned not to trust easily. By 16, he graduated from the École Militaire in Paris and became a second lieutenant of artillery. The promotion represented years of hard work and demonstrated ability, but it also marked him as part of the military establishment of the very nation that had conquered his homeland. He was now officially French, a servant of the crown that had displaced the independence his father had once fought for. The contradiction seemed to bother him less than it might have. He was already thinking beyond the narrow confines of nationality, seeing himself as part of a larger historical drama. He was precise, meticulous, and more interested in logistics than socializing. While other young officers spent their free time gambling, drinking, or pursuing women, Napoleon spent hours drawing up hypothetical battles, calculating angles, studying fortifications. He filled notebooks with diagrams of siege works and analyses of famous battles, always asking himself what he would have done differently. He saw war as a chessboard, and he played to win. His early postings took him to garrisons in provincial towns, where the routine was mind-numbing, and the prospects for advancement seemed limited. He chafed at the peacetime army's emphasis on parade ground drilling and social connections. He watched older officers advance through family ties and political influence, while more capable men stagnated in remote postings. The experience reinforced his belief that merit should triumph over birth, an idea that would later find expression in his reforms. During these years, he also began to write. He drafted novels, political treatises, and historical analyses, none of which were published, but all of which revealed a mind grappling with large questions. He wrote about the nature of power, the relationship between rulers and ruled, the conditions that create great men and great nations. His prose was stilted and overly dramatic, but it showed a young man trying to understand his place in the world and his role in history. Then came the French Revolution. The monarchy fell, the old world crumbled, and in the chaos, Napoleon found his opening. The revolution that began in 1789 swept away centuries of tradition and hierarchy, creating a new world where talent and ambition could triumph over birth and breeding. For a young Corsican officer with limited prospects under the old regime, the revolution offered unprecedented opportunities. He aligned with the Jacobin, the radical faction, and supported the Republic. This was not merely opportunism, though calculation certainly played a role. Napoleon genuinely believed in many of the revolution's ideals: merit-based advancement, legal equality, rational governance, and the rejection of arbitrary privilege. He had experienced firsthand the limitations of the aristocratic system, and he welcomed its overthrow. He wrote pamphlets supporting the Republic and cultivated relationships with influential political figures. The revolution also brought war. The European powers, alarmed by the example of regicide and popular uprising, formed coalitions to crush the French Republic. France found itself fighting for its life against enemies on multiple fronts. The army expanded rapidly, creating opportunities for advancement that would have been impossible under the old system. Young officers who demonstrated ability could rise through the ranks with unprecedented speed. When Royalists tried to seize power in 1795, Napoleon was there, commanding artillery in the streets of Paris. The uprising, known as the 13 Vendémiaires, represented a critical moment for the Republic. Royalist forces had gathered in the capital, hoping to overthrow the revolutionary government and restore the monarchy. The situation was desperate, and the government needed officers who could act decisively without hesitation. Napoleon was chosen for the task, partly because of his technical expertise with artillery, and partly because of his political reliability. He had proven his loyalty to the Republic, and he had no sentimental attachment to the old regime. When the moment came, he ordered grapeshot to be fired on the insurgents. Decision was brutal, but effective. Grapeshot turned cannon into giant shotguns, spraying hundreds of musket balls into the crowd of Royalist supporters. The uprising collapsed, and he was hailed as the savior of the city. The success at Vendémiaire transformed Napoleon's career and reputation. Overnight, he became a national hero. The shy, studious young officer from Corsica was suddenly one of the most famous men in France. He was promoted to general and handed command of the Army of Italy, a force hungry, underpaid, and poorly equipped. The appointment seemed like a reward for political loyalty rather than military expertise, and many observers expected him to fail. The Army of Italy was in terrible condition. The soldiers had not been paid in months, their uniforms were in tatters, and their equipment was outdated. Morale was low, and discipline was breaking down. Many of the officers were political appointees with little military experience, and the army had suffered a series of defeats against Austrian forces. It seemed like an impossible command, a poisoned chalice that would destroy whatever reputation Napoleon had built. Yet in less than a year, he transformed them into a fearsome engine of conquest. His first act was to address the army's immediate needs: pay, food, and equipment. He used his political connections to secure supplies and made sure the soldiers received their back wages. He reorganized the command structure, promoting capable officers and removing incompetent ones. He personally inspected units, talked to common soldiers, and demonstrated that he understood their concerns. More importantly, he gave them victories. He marched them across the Alps, defeated Austria's forces in a series of dazzling victories, and brought home riches, territory, and glory. The Italian campaign of 1796 to 1797 established Napoleon as one of the greatest military commanders in history. He moved his armies with speed and precision, concentrated his forces at decisive points, and defeated larger Austrian and Piedmontese armies in detail. His victories at Montenotte, Millesimo, Mondovi, Lodi, and Rivoli demonstrated tactical brilliance and strategic vision. The campaign also revealed Napoleon's understanding of the psychological aspects of warfare. He knew that morale was as important as materiel, and he cultivated his soldiers' loyalty through shared hardship and spectacular success. He issued proclamations praising their courage and promising them glory. He made sure they shared in the spoils of victory, allowing them to loot conquered territories and send money home to their families. The ragged, demoralized force he had inherited became a devoted instrument of his will. More than a military commander, he styled himself as a bringer of order. He organized administrations, issued reforms, and patronized artists to record his triumphs. In the territories he conquered, he established efficient governments, reformed legal systems, and promoted economic development. He positioned himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror, someone who brought the benefits of French civilization to backward regions. He abolished feudalism, established religious tolerance, and created new institutions based on merit rather than birth. He sent reports back to Paris, filled with dramatic accounts of his own genius. These dispatches were masterpieces of self-promotion, carefully crafted to enhance his reputation and build his political capital. He described his victories in vivid detail, emphasizing his personal role in achieving success. He portrayed himself as a man of destiny, someone chosen by Providence to lead France to greatness. The reports were published in newspapers and circulated throughout the country, making Napoleon a household name. He understood image. He cultivated myth. Every aspect of his public persona was carefully calculated to enhance his reputation and build his legend. He commissioned paintings showing him in dramatic poses, crossing bridges under fire, or pointing the way forward through mountain passes. He wore distinctive uniforms that made him instantly recognizable on the battlefield. Even the size of his hat, the iconic bicorn, was a conscious choice to make himself instantly recognizable in the chaos of battle. The art of self-presentation came naturally to him, perhaps because he had spent so many years as an outsider learning to read the subtle signals of power and status. He understood that leadership was as much about theater as substance, that men followed symbols as much as they followed flesh and blood commanders. His famous gray coat became a talisman for his soldiers, a reassuring presence that meant their leader was near. When he walked among the troops before battle, he made sure to be seen, to exchange a few words with common soldiers, to demonstrate that he shared their dangers and hardships. But beneath the carefully constructed image lay a man of genuine complexity. He was capable of extraordinary kindness and breathtaking cruelty, sometimes within the same hour. He could spend hours listening to the problems of a simple soldier, then order the execution of prisoners without apparent emotion. He rewarded loyalty lavishly, but punished betrayal with merciless efficiency. Those who served him well found themselves elevated beyond their wildest dreams, while those who disappointed him discovered that his favor, once lost, was nearly impossible to regain. His relationship with women revealed another side of his character. Despite his reputation as a great lover, he was often awkward and uncertain in romantic situations. His first serious relationship with Desiree Clary ended when her family considered him an unsuitable match for their daughter. His marriage to Josephine de Beauharnais was passionate but troubled, marked by her infidelities and his jealousy. He wrote her letters that were by turns tender and demanding, revealing a man who craved emotional connection, but struggled to maintain it. The marriage to Josephine also demonstrated his political calculations. She was a widow of the Revolution, someone whose husband had been guillotined during the Terror. By marrying her, Napoleon aligned himself with the revolutionary cause and gained access to important political networks. But the relationship was never merely political. He genuinely loved her, even as he understood the advantages the marriage brought. When he eventually divorced her to marry Marie-Louise of Austria, he wept openly, showing a vulnerability that few ever witnessed. His capacity for work was legendary. He typically slept only 4 or 5 hours a night, rising before dawn to review reports and correspondence. He dictated letters while dressing, discussed strategy during meals, and made decisions while riding between appointments. His secretary struggled to keep up with his pace, and his staff learned to function on minimal sleep. He seemed to thrive on the constant activity, as if motion itself was necessary to maintain his energy and focus. The administrative reforms he implemented revealed his vision of rational, efficient government. He believed that society should be organized according to logical principles rather than historical accident or traditional privilege. The prefect system he established centralized authority while ensuring that local administration remained responsive to Paris. He created a national system of roads, bridges, and canals that connected remote regions to the center of power. His educational reforms established schools that produced trained administrators and military officers, creating a new class of professional public servants. His legal reforms were perhaps his most lasting achievement. The Civil Code, later known as the Napoleonic Code, represented a comprehensive attempt to codify the principles of justice and equality that had emerged from the Revolution. It established uniform legal standards throughout the empire, protected property rights, and guaranteed equality before the law. The code was exported to conquered territories and adopted by nations around the world, making it one of the most influential legal documents in history. But the code also reflected the limitations of Napoleon's vision. While it guaranteed legal equality for men, it relegated women to a subordinate status, requiring them to obey their husbands and fathers. It protected property rights, but said little about the rights of workers or the poor. It established religious tolerance, but maintained the privileged position of the Catholic Church. The code embodied the bourgeois values of the Revolution, while ignoring its more radical democratic aspirations. The success in Italy made him the most famous man in France, but it also created political problems. The government in Paris, known as the Directory, was suspicious of successful generals who might threaten civilian authority. Napoleon's growing popularity and independence made him a potential rival to the political leadership. He needed a new assignment that would keep him busy and away from domestic politics. The Directory's concerns were not unfounded. Throughout French history, successful generals had often posed threats to civilian government. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, Cromwell had dissolved parliament, and countless military commanders had used their armies to seize political power. The directors remembered these precedents and watched Napoleon's growing influence with increasing alarm. They needed him for his military expertise, but they feared him for his ambition and popularity. Napoleon understood their concerns and played a careful game. He maintained his loyalty to the government while building his own power base. He cultivated relationships with key political figures, supported their policies publicly, and avoided any appearance of disloyalty. But he also made sure that his achievements were widely known and celebrated. He built a network of supporters in the press, the military, and the bureaucracy. He was preparing for the future, even as he served the present government faithfully. The political situation in France was becoming increasingly unstable. The Directory had been created as a compromise solution to the problem of revolutionary government, but it satisfied no one completely. Royalists wanted the restoration of the monarchy, Jacobin wanted a return to radical democracy, and moderates wanted stable, effective government. The Directory provided none of these things consistently. It was weak, corrupt, and unable to address the nation's mounting problems. Economic difficulties plagued the country. The assignats, the revolutionary paper money, had become nearly worthless due to inflation and speculation. Trade was disrupted by war, and the government struggled to finance its military campaigns. Tax collection was inefficient, and many regions resisted central authority. The urban poor suffered from high prices and unemployment, while rural areas were devastated by conscription and requisitions. The revolution had promised prosperity, but it had delivered hardship instead. Military failures had also damaged the Directory's reputation. While Napoleon won victories in Italy, other French armies suffered defeats in Germany and elsewhere. The war effort was poorly coordinated, and resources were wasted on futile campaigns. The government's military strategy seemed to lack coherence and direction. Critics argued that the Directory was incompetent and that France needed stronger leadership to achieve victory. Religious conflict continued to divide French society. The revolutionary government had tried to replace Catholicism with a new civic religion, but most French people remained attached to traditional beliefs. The persecution of priests and the destruction of churches had created deep resentment in many communities. The Directory's attempts to find a middle ground satisfied neither secularists nor believers. The country needed a solution that would restore religious peace without abandoning revolutionary principles. In 1798, he turned his eyes to Egypt, a campaign intended to strike at British trade routes and project French power across the Mediterranean. The expedition was bold and strange. Egypt was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, but it was effectively controlled by the Mamluks, a warrior caste that had ruled the region for centuries. The strategic rationale was to threaten British interests in India and establish French influence in the Middle East. But the campaign was also driven by Napoleon's personal ambitions and his fascination with ancient history. Napoleon brought with him not only soldiers, but engineers, artists, and scholars. The expedition included some of the most distinguished scientists and intellectuals in France, men who would study Egyptian antiquities, map the region, and record its natural history. They mapped, cataloged, and recorded ancient ruins. They discovered the Rosetta Stone. It was part conquest, part performance, part personal epic. The Egyptian campaign revealed Napoleon's vision of himself as more than just a military commander. He saw himself as a new Alexander, someone who would conquer not just territories, but also knowledge. He studied the region's history, learned about its customs, and presented himself as a student of its civilization. He issued proclamations comparing himself to ancient conquerors and suggesting that he was fulfilling historical destiny. The expedition's scholarly component was unprecedented in military history. Napoleon brought along the Institut d'Egypte, a learned society that included mathematicians, astronomers, engineers, naturalists, and artists. These men were tasked with studying every aspect of Egyptian civilization, from ancient monuments to modern customs. They measured pyramids, copied hieroglyphics, collected specimens, and documented their findings in meticulous detail. Their work would eventually be published as the massive Description de l'Egypte, one of the great scholarly achievements of the age. The presence of scholars on a military expedition reflected Napoleon's belief that conquest should serve the cause of human knowledge. He saw himself as a patron of learning, someone who used military power to advance civilization. This vision appealed to the intellectuals of the Enlightenment, who had long argued that reason and knowledge should guide human affairs. By combining military conquest with scholarly research, Napoleon positioned himself as the embodiment of Enlightenment ideals. The expedition also revealed his fascination with ancient history and his desire to associate himself with great figures of the past. He visited the pyramids and claimed to have calculated their mathematical properties. He stood before the Sphinx and contemplated the mysteries of ancient Egypt. He compared himself to Alexander the Great, who had conquered Egypt more than 2,000 years earlier. These gestures were partly theatrical, but they also reflected genuine intellectual curiosity and ambition. His proclamations to the Egyptian people demonstrated his understanding of propaganda and his ability to adapt his message to different audiences. He presented himself as a liberator who had come to free Egypt from Mamluk oppression. He claimed to respect Islam and promised to protect religious freedom. He argued that the French were the true friends of Muslims and that he was following in the footsteps of great Islamic conquerors. These claims were largely false, but they showed his awareness of the importance of winning popular support. The military aspects of the campaign were initially successful. Napoleon's forces defeated the Mamluks at the Battle of the Pyramids, crushing their cavalry charges with disciplined infantry squares and artillery fire. The Mamluk warriors were brave and skilled, but their medieval tactics were no match for modern European military technology. French discipline and firepower proved decisive, and the Mamluk army was destroyed as an effective fighting force. Cairo fell, and Napoleon established himself as the master of Egypt. He organized a new government, promoted economic development, and patronized scholarly research. He tried to present himself as a benevolent ruler who was modernizing Egypt and bringing it into the contemporary world. He established hospitals, schools, and workshops. He encouraged trade and tried to improve agricultural productivity. He even attempted to learn Arabic and understand Islamic law. But the expedition faced enormous challenges from the beginning. The climate was harsh, and European soldiers struggled to adapt to the heat and desert conditions. Disease was rampant, and thousands of French soldiers died from plague, dysentery, and other illnesses. Supplies were difficult to obtain, and the army was often short of food, water, and ammunition. The local population was hostile, and French forces faced constant harassment from Bedouin raiders. The destruction of the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile compounded these problems. Admiral Nelson's victory eliminated French naval power in the Mediterranean and left Napoleon's army stranded in a hostile land. Without control of the sea, the French could not receive reinforcements or supplies from Europe. They were cut off from home and forced to live off the land in a region that could barely support its own population. For a time, it seemed like another triumph to add to his growing legend. Napoleon's propaganda machine worked overtime to present the expedition as a great success. French newspapers published accounts of glorious victories and scholarly discoveries. The public was told that Napoleon was extending French power across the Mediterranean and bringing civilization to a backward region. The reality was more complicated, but the myth proved more powerful than the facts. But while he triumphed on land, his fleet was destroyed at the Battle of the Nile. Admiral Nelson's British fleet caught the French ships anchored in Abu Qir Bay and destroyed them in a devastating night battle. The loss cut Napoleon's army off from France and left them stranded in a hostile land. Without naval support, the expedition became a costly adventure with no clear exit strategy. Napoleon's response to this setback revealed his mastery of propaganda and narrative control. Cut off from France, he spun the narrative in his favor and eventually returned to Paris without warning. He emphasized his land victories while downplaying the naval defeat. He portrayed the campaign as a great adventure that had brought glory to French arms and advanced the cause of human knowledge. The scholars' discoveries, particularly the Rosetta Stone, provided concrete evidence of the expedition's value. His return to France in 1799 came at a critical moment. The government, known as the Directory, was weak and deeply unpopular. Military defeats had damaged its reputation. Economic problems had created widespread discontent, and political instability had made effective governance impossible. The Directory was a compromise solution that satisfied no one, and it lacked the legitimacy or competence to address France's mounting problems. The timing of Napoleon's return was perfect, though whether by design or accident remains debated by historians. He had been following events in France through correspondence and newspapers, and he understood that the political situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Directory was losing control, and various factions were maneuvering for position. Some wanted to restore the monarchy, others wanted to return to radical democracy, and still others wanted military dictatorship. The country was ready for strong leadership, and Napoleon was prepared to provide it. His journey back to France was carefully managed to maximize dramatic effect. He traveled in secret, avoiding British naval patrols and slipping into the port of Frejus undetected. News of his return spread quickly, and crowds gathered to welcome him as he made his way to Paris. He was hailed as a hero who had returned to save the nation in its hour of need. The contrast with his secret departure from Egypt could not have been more striking. His arrival in Paris created a sensation. The capital was buzzing with rumors and speculation about his intentions. Some welcomed him as a potential savior, while others feared that he might seize power for himself. The Directory tried to maintain control over the situation, but it was clear that Napoleon's return had changed the political landscape fundamentally. He was no longer just another general. He was a potential ruler. The political situation was complicated by the presence of multiple factions and competing interests. The Directory itself was divided, with different members pursuing different strategies. Some wanted to use Napoleon's popularity to strengthen their own position, while others saw him as a threat to civilian government. The legislature was similarly divided, with various groups supporting different solutions to the nation's problems. Napoleon moved carefully, building alliances and assessing the political terrain. He met with key figures from different factions, listened to their concerns, and gradually assembled a coalition of supporters. He was particularly careful to maintain good relationships with moderate politicians who wanted stability and order. He presented himself as a man above party politics, someone who could unite the nation and restore effective government. The conspiracy that led to the coup of 18 Brumaire was months in the making. Napoleon worked closely with Abbé Sieyes, one of the directors, and his own brother Lucien, who was president of the Council of 500. They carefully planned every aspect of the operation, from the legal justifications to the military preparations. The goal was to create a new government that would be both legitimate and effective. The coup itself was a masterpiece of political theater. Napoleon used his military prestige to intimidate potential opponents, while his political allies managed the legal formalities. The operation was presented as a constitutional change rather than a military takeover, though everyone understood that force lay behind the legal maneuvers. The Directory was dissolved, and a new government was established with Napoleon as one of 3 consuls. Napoleon, still in his early 30s, sensed the moment. He had the military reputation, political connections, and personal charisma needed to seize power. With the support of key allies, including his brother Lucien and the Abbé Sieyes, he staged a coup in 1799. The coup of 18 Brumaire was carefully planned and expertly executed. Napoleon used his military prestige to intimidate potential opponents, while his political allies managed the legal formalities. The new government was called the Consulate. He was named First Consul. It sounded like a Roman throwback, modest and shared. The title evoked the renowned republic, suggesting that power would be exercised collectively and temporarily. Napoleon presented himself as a reluctant leader who had accepted power only to serve the nation's needs. He spoke of his desire to restore order and stability after years of revolutionary chaos. But in practice, power gathered in his hands. The other consuls were quickly marginalized, and Napoleon made all the important decisions. He controlled the military, dominated the legislature, and shaped policy in every area of government. Within months, it became clear that the consulate was a dictatorship in all but name. Napoleon had achieved what the monarchs of Europe had failed to do. He had ended the French Revolution. He reformed the tax code, the legal system, the military structure. The Napoleonic reforms were comprehensive and enduring, creating institutions that lasted long after his fall. He established a merit-based civil service, created a national system of education, and reorganized the administration of justice. The Concordat with the Catholic Church ended years of religious conflict and restored stability to French society. The Civil Code codified legal principles that were adopted throughout Europe and beyond. These reforms revealed Napoleon's vision of rational, efficient government. He believed that society should be organized according to logical principles rather than historical accident or traditional privilege. He promoted careers based on talent rather than birth, established uniform legal standards, and created institutions designed to serve the common good. His reforms embodied Enlightenment ideals of reason, progress, and human improvement. In 1804, with the nation behind him and the church carefully managed, he crowned himself Emperor of the French. The ceremony was a masterpiece of political theater, combining traditional symbols with revolutionary innovation. Not content to be handed a crown, he took it from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. The gesture symbolized his independence from both religious and secular authority. He was emperor by his own will and achievement, not by divine appointment or hereditary right. The coronation marked the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire. Napoleon had traveled from revolutionary general to absolute ruler in less than a decade. He had preserved some of the revolution's achievements while discarding its democratic ideals. He offered the French people order, stability, and glory in exchange for their freedom. He was no longer just a soldier. He was the state. Every aspect of French government reflected his will and served his purposes. The bureaucracy implemented his policies, the military carried out his orders, and the educational system promoted his values. He had created a new form of dictatorship, one that claimed to serve the people while concentrating all power in a single person. France under Napoleon was a paradox. It retained the revolutionary promise of merit and secular law, but centralized authority under one man. Citizens enjoyed legal equality and religious freedom, but they could not criticize the government or choose their leaders. The economy prospered, but commerce was regulated to serve state interests. Education expanded, but schools taught loyalty to the emperor rather than critical thinking. His civil code established legal equality and property rights, yet suppressed dissent. The code was Napoleon's greatest domestic achievement, a comprehensive legal framework that protected individual rights while maintaining social order. It enshrined principles of legal equality, religious tolerance, and property rights that had emerged from the Revolution. But it also reflected Napoleon's authoritarian instincts, concentrating power in the state and limiting individual freedoms. His reign brought economic stability, educational reform, and military success, but also censorship and relentless war. The Napoleonic system delivered on its promises of order and prosperity, but at the cost of political freedom and international peace. The continental system, designed to exclude British trade from Europe, created economic hardship and resentment among France's allies. The constant warfare drained the nation's resources and created a cycle of conflict that would ultimately destroy the empire. He knew how to inspire, how to command, how to bend the machinery of government to his will. Napoleon was a master of leadership, someone who could motivate soldiers to charge into certain death and inspire bureaucrats to work tirelessly for the state. He understood human psychology and used that knowledge to build loyalty and maintain control. He rewarded merit, punished failure, and created a system where advancement depended on service to the empire. He made himself the center of an empire, one that would stretch from the coasts of Spain to the forests of Poland. At its height, the Napoleonic Empire controlled most of continental Europe. French armies occupied major capitals. French law governed conquered territories, and French culture influenced elite society from Madrid to Warsaw. Napoleon had created a new form of European order, one based on French hegemony and his personal authority. His portraits showed him calm, composed, unblinking. The official iconography of the empire presented Napoleon as a figure of destiny, someone chosen by Providence to lead Europe toward a new age. Artists like Jacques-Louis David created images that emphasized his strength, intelligence, and determination. These portraits were distributed throughout the empire, making his face familiar to millions of subjects who would never see him in person. His speeches were short and cutting. He rarely raised his voice, but when he entered a room, silence followed. Napoleon understood the power of presence and the importance of maintaining dignity. He cultivated an aura of authority that made others defer to his judgment. His verbal style was direct and economical, free of the flowery rhetoric that had characterized revolutionary oratory. He spoke to be understood and obeyed, not to entertain or persuade. And yet, for all the grandeur, there was restlessness. He had built an empire of movement, a legacy that relied on momentum. Napoleon could not rest on his achievements because his system required constant expansion and victory. Each triumph created new challenges and new enemies. Success bred ambition, and ambition demanded action. The empire was like a bicycle that would fall over if it stopped moving. And so the campaigns continued, against Austria, against Prussia, against Russia. Each new war was justified as necessary for French security or European stability, but each victory made the next conflict more likely. Napoleon's enemies learned from their defeats and adapted their strategies. Coalition after coalition formed to contain French power, and each war became more difficult and costly than the last. He crowned kings, restructured borders, and marched his armies further and further. The Napoleonic system created a new European order based on French hegemony and rational governance. Napoleon placed his relatives on foreign thrones, redrew the map of Europe, and imposed French legal and administrative systems on conquered territories. He genuinely believed he was bringing civilization and progress to backward regions, but his subjects often saw him as a foreign oppressor. But the higher he climbed, the more precarious the summit. Old enemies gathered strength. His appetite for conquest pushed into fragile alliances. The very success that made Napoleon master of Europe also created the conditions for his downfall. Britain remained unconquered and used its naval power to organize coalition after coalition against French hegemony. Russia, Prussia, and Austria learned to cooperate despite their traditional rivalries. Even France's allies began to chafe under the burdens of the continental system and constant warfare. And even as he stood at the height of his power, there were shadows waiting at the edges. The Spanish uprising showed that nationalist resistance could drain French resources and tie down large armies. The disastrous invasion of Russia demonstrated that Napoleon was not invincible and that his empire had limits. The German War of Liberation proved that occupied peoples could be mobilized against French rule. Each crack in the edifice revealed underlying weaknesses that would eventually bring the whole structure down. For now, though, he was emperor, a man risen from a rocky island in the Mediterranean to command the destiny of a continent. He had achieved everything he had dreamed of as a young officer reading about Alexander and Caesar. He ruled an empire larger than Charlemagne's, commanded armies more powerful than Rome's legions, and exercised authority more absolute than any monarch's. He was the master of Europe and the arbiter of its fate. And as his empire expanded, so too did the machinery around him. Not just soldiers and cannon, but culture, symbols, and secrets. The Napoleonic system was more than a military and political organization. It was a comprehensive attempt to remake European civilization according to rational principles. Artists, writers, scientists, and scholars all served the empire's purposes. Museums were established, libraries were organized, and archives were created to preserve and transmit knowledge. The empire generated an enormous amount of documentation. Every decree, every dispatch, every administrative decision was recorded and filed. The bureaucracy produced millions of pages of correspondence, reports, and records. Military campaigns were documented in minute detail. Diplomatic negotiations were preserved in official archives. The empire was a vast information processing machine that generated knowledge as well as power. But with documentation came secrets. Not everything could be made public. Sensitive negotiations, intelligence reports, and strategic plans required careful handling. The empire developed sophisticated systems for protecting classified information and controlling access to sensitive materials. Codes and ciphers were used to secure communications. Special couriers carried important messages. Access to certain documents was restricted to trusted officials. Let's leave the battlefield behind for a moment and step into something quieter. A place of velvet-bound books, gilt bindings, and candlelight. Let's enter a room filled with whispers, where maps and margins told stories no battlefield ever could. The imperial libraries and archives were treasure houses of knowledge and power, repositories of secrets that could make or break careers, kingdoms, and empires. Because what vanished from those rooms may tell us as much about Napoleon as what survived. In the shadows between the official records and the public proclamations. Between the victory bulletins and the diplomatic correspondence lay another story. A story of documents that disappeared, of records that were altered, of secrets that were buried so deep that even now, more than 2 centuries later, we are still trying to understand what really happened in those candlelit chambers where the fate of Europe was decided by the stroke of a pen. In the quiet corners of power, there are always books. Not just the ones you read, but the ones you annotate, carry with you, and keep close. For Napoleon Bonaparte, these books were more than pastimes or decoration. They were tools, weapons of thought, carefully selected companions that helped him shape an empire, command loyalty, and plan war. He loved books, deeply and deliberately. His personal library reflected his layered identity. Part general, part statesman, part philosopher. He read history, geography, military strategy, and the classics. His copies of Caesar's commentaries, Plutarch's Lives, and works by Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Machiavelli were not left to gather dust. He filled their margins with notes in his tight, often spiky handwriting. His thoughts were direct, sometimes dismissive, always strategic. The emperor's relationship with the written word began in his youth on Corsica, where books were scarce and precious. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, had managed to accumulate a modest collection of legal texts and classical works, but young Napoleon devoured them with an intensity that alarmed his family. Even as a child, he approached reading not as entertainment, but as conquest. Each page turned was territory gained. Each concept mastered was another tool in his arsenal. At the military academy in Brienne, Napoleon's appetite for books became legendary among his classmates. While other cadets spent their free time in games or idle conversation, he could be found in the library, often reading by candlelight long after the prescribed hours. He consumed histories of Alexander, Caesar, and Charlemagne with particular fervor, but his interests ranged far beyond military biography. He read Rousseau's political philosophy, D'Alembert's mathematical treatises, and even Oriental tales that fired his imagination about distant lands and exotic conquests. His instructors noted something peculiar about his reading habits. Napoleon didn't simply absorb information, he interrogated it. His copies of textbooks were dense with marginalia, filled with challenges to the author's assumptions, corrections to their facts, and extensions of their arguments. A geometry text might contain not just worked problems, but entirely new theorems scrawled in the margins. A history of Rome might feature lengthy rebuttals to the author's interpretation of particular battles or political decisions. This pattern of active, combative reading would define Napoleon's intellectual life. Books were not authorities to be accepted, but adversaries to be engaged, conquered, and ultimately absorbed into his own expanding worldview. He approached Plutarch's accounts of ancient generals with the same skeptical intensity he would later bring to intelligence reports from his own campaigns. Every author was a potential teacher, but also a potential fool to be corrected. Wherever he went, he brought books. On campaign, in exile, and even on board ships. His traveling library was a kind of mental fortress. In the field, he kept about 150 volumes at hand, carefully packed into leather cases designed to withstand the rigors of war. Each book had a specific purpose. There were histories of previous empires, military manuals, atlases, and even novels, all selected to keep his mind sharp and his command focused. The logistics of maintaining a traveling library across the battlefields of Europe were staggering. Napoleon employed a small army of clerks and valets whose primary responsibility was the care and transport of his books. Each volume was wrapped in oiled cloth to protect against moisture, secured with leather straps to prevent damage during rough transport, and cataloged with meticulous care. The emperor's reading cases were among the most carefully guarded items in his baggage train, often receiving better protection than the army's gold reserves. During the Italian campaigns, Napoleon's mobile library proved its worth time and again. Between battles, he would retire to his tent and immerse himself in accounts of Hannibal's tactics or Caesar's diplomacy, searching for insights that might apply to his current situation. His subordinates learned to recognize the signs. When Napoleon emerged from his tent with a particular book in hand, they knew he had conceived some new strategic innovation inspired by his reading. The famous march across the Alps in 1800 nearly ended in disaster when a mule carrying one of Napoleon's bookcases stumbled on the treacherous mountain paths. The emperor himself dismounted to help rescue the scattered volumes, much to the amazement of his soldiers, who couldn't understand why their commander valued these leather-bound objects more than additional ammunition or supplies. But Napoleon understood something they didn't. Battles were won first in the mind, and his books were the weapons with which he fought those preliminary engagements. His selection of traveling volumes revealed the breadth of his intellectual ambitions. Alongside the expected military histories and tactical manuals, he carried works of poetry, philosophy, and science. Ossian's supposed ancient Celtic epics traveled with him across Italy and Egypt, their romantic visions of heroic deeds and noble sacrifice feeding his own mythic self-conception. Mathematical treatises by Lagrange and Laplace accompanied him on campaigns, their abstract principles somehow finding practical application in the calculation of artillery trajectories and the organization of supply lines. The library in his private residence, however, was something more elaborate. At the Tuileries Palace in Paris, at Malmaison, and later on Elba, Napoleon amassed hundreds of volumes, sometimes thousands. He ordered copies of rare works, employed librarians to catalog and manage them, and constantly updated the collection with fresh material from publishers and scholars across Europe. Many of these books carried his personal seal, or were bound in leather, embossed with imperial insignias. The scale of Napoleon's residential libraries was unprecedented for a military leader. At the Tuileries, an entire wing was devoted to his collection, with specially designed shelves that could be adjusted to accommodate volumes of different sizes. The emperor insisted on a particular organizational system that defied traditional library science. Books were arranged not by subject or author, but by what he called operational relevance. Works on Roman law might sit next to modern treatises on hydraulic engineering. If Napoleon saw connections between their principles, it could be applied to current administrative challenges. The collection grew through multiple channels. Napoleon maintained correspondence with scholars and publishers across Europe, often commissioning special editions or translations of works that interested him. He established what amounted to a literary intelligence network, with agents in major European cities tasked with acquiring rare manuscripts and reporting on new publications. The emperor's librarians included some of the most learned men of their age, scholars who had been recruited not just for their cataloging skills, but for their ability to identify works that might capture their master's interest. At Malmaison, Josephine initially complained about the invasion of books into what she considered her domestic space, but she soon learned to appreciate the library's political utility. Foreign dignitaries and potential allies could be subtly impressed by the breadth of the emperor's learning, while the presence of banned or controversial works demonstrated Napoleon's intellectual fearlessness. The library became a kind of diplomatic tool, its contents carefully curated to send messages about the emperor's character and capabilities. The acquisition of entire libraries through conquest added another dimension to Napoleon's collecting. When French armies occupied foreign capitals, Napoleon's librarians were often among the first to examine the collections of displaced rulers and nobles. The best volumes would be requisitioned for the imperial library, a practice that Napoleon justified as preserving important works for the benefit of scholarship. In reality, it was intellectual plunder on a massive scale. From the Vatican Library came rare manuscripts and incunabula that had been carefully preserved by generations of Catholic scholars. From the libraries of German princes came works on administration and statecraft that would inform Napoleon's reorganization of the Holy Roman Empire. From Spanish monasteries came chronicles and histories that provided insights into the governance of distant colonies. Each conquest expanded not just the borders of Napoleon's empire, but the boundaries of his intellectual domain. The emperor's reading habits were as distinctive as his collection methods. He read with extraordinary speed, often finishing several volumes in a single evening. But his reading was never passive. He approached each book with a specific question in mind, searching for information or insights that could be applied to immediate problems. His marginalia reveal a mind constantly drawing connections between seemingly unrelated ideas, finding practical applications for abstract principles, and testing theoretical concepts against his own experience. His notes on Machiavelli's The Prince, for example, are filled with contemporary examples and counterexamples drawn from his own political career. Where Machiavelli discusses the importance of appearing virtuous while acting pragmatically, Napoleon notes specific instances where this principle had served him well, or where its violation had cost him dearly. His copy of the work is less a book than a manual for power, annotated with the hard-won wisdom of actual experience. But after his fall, after the great machinery of empire unraveled, his library did something unusual. It began to disappear. Some of it was expected. When Napoleon was first exiled to Elba in 1814, he took a portion of his collection with him. Around 400 volumes accompanied him to the island. He read them obsessively, sometimes late into the night. He often reread Caesar and Xenophon, finding comfort and perhaps warning in the stories of fallen rulers and long marches. But the rest of his library, scattered across France and beyond, was less fortunate. The process of selecting which books would accompany Napoleon to Elba reveals the depth of his attachment to particular volumes. He spent hours in his library at Fontainebleau, pulling books from the shelves and examining them with the intensity of a general reviewing troops before battle. Some volumes he rejected immediately, works that had perhaps outlived their usefulness or failed to maintain his interest. Others he held for long minutes, weighing their value against the limited space available in his exile baggage. The 400 volumes that made the journey to Elba were chosen with exquisite care. Military histories dominated, but there were also works of poetry, philosophy, and science. His copy of Plutarch's Lives, heavily annotated with comparisons to his own career, was among the first selected. Several volumes of Voltaire's correspondence, with their elegant prose and cynical observations about power, earned places in the traveling collection. A complete set of the Encyclopédie was deemed too bulky, but Napoleon selected individual volumes that covered topics he anticipated might be relevant to his reduced circumstances. On Elba, Napoleon's reading took on a different character. No longer the urgent, purposeful study of an active ruler, it became more reflective, more melancholy. He reread familiar works with new eyes, seeing in them parallels to his own rise and fall that had been invisible during his years of power. Caesar's account of crossing the Rubicon, once read as a manual for seizing opportunity, now seemed like a warning about the price of ambition. Plutarch's portraits of great men brought low by fortune resonated with painful immediacy. The emperor's reading habits on Elba were observed and recorded by his small retinue, who noted the almost obsessive quality of his attention to certain passages. He would spend entire evenings with a single volume, reading and rereading particular sections, making new notes in the margins, and often talking to himself about the text. His copy of Ossian's poems, which had once inspired visions of glory, now seemed to offer consolation for defeat. The melancholy tone of the supposed ancient bard matched Napoleon's own mood during the darker moments of his exile. But even in exile, Napoleon's library continued to serve practical purposes. As he began to plan his return to France, he consulted histories of previous political resurrections, studying the methods by which fallen leaders had regained power. His reading during the 100 Days was intensely focused on precedents and strategies, as if the accumulated wisdom of centuries could somehow guarantee the success of his desperate gamble. After Waterloo, when Napoleon was exiled again, this time to the far more remote island of St. Helena, only a fraction of his books followed. Shipping was limited, and his captors were far less indulgent. A handful of his favorite volumes were eventually delivered, but many never made the journey. Instead, they lingered in Europe, and from there, they began to vanish. The restrictions placed on Napoleon's reading material at St. Helena revealed the British government's understanding of the connection between his intellectual life and his political power. Sir Hudson Lowe, the island's governor, carefully scrutinized every book that arrived for the former emperor, searching for potentially seditious content or coded messages from supporters in Europe. Works on military strategy were automatically suspect, as were any books dealing with contemporary politics or recent French history. The process of censorship was both petty and revealing. Napoleon's request for a copy of Byron's poetry was initially denied on the grounds that the poet's reputation for rebellion might provide a bad example. His desire to read recent works on chemistry and natural philosophy was viewed with suspicion, as if knowledge of scientific principles might somehow be weaponized against his captors. Even apparently innocent works of literature were examined for hidden meanings or subversive implications. The psychological impact of this literary deprivation was profound. Napoleon, who had spent his entire adult life surrounded by books, now found himself intellectually isolated on a tiny island with only a handful of familiar volumes for company. The man who had once commanded the literary resources of an empire was reduced to reading the same few books over and over again, mining them for insights he had already extracted years earlier. Some were stolen. Palace staff, military officials, and even visiting diplomats took books as souvenirs. A few turned up with pages cut out or replaced, their bindings removed, their contents altered. Others were sold. In the years following his death in 1821, collectors quietly bought Napoleon's books from auction houses, private estates, or anonymous sellers. Some knew exactly what they were purchasing. Others did not. The systematic looting of Napoleon's libraries began even before his final defeat. During the chaotic weeks following the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, as French forces retreated across Germany, several crates of books from the emperor's traveling library were abandoned and subsequently pillaged by Austrian and Prussian troops. Most of the soldiers who took these volumes had no idea of their significance. They were simply portable items that might be sold or traded for more practical necessities. The real devastation came later, during the occupations of Paris and the dismantling of the imperial administration. Palace servants, many of whom had served Napoleon faithfully for years, suddenly found themselves unemployed and desperate. Books from the imperial library provided a ready source of income, and many volumes were sold to Parisian booksellers, who asked no questions about their provenance. The imperial seals and distinctive bindings that had once proclaimed Napoleon's ownership now made the books more valuable to collectors, but also more dangerous to possess. Foreign diplomats and military officers proved particularly acquisitive. British officials, who had spent years fighting Napoleon's armies, seemed to take special pleasure in acquiring volumes from his personal collection. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. The man who had once threatened to invade Britain now saw his most treasured possessions carried off to London drawing rooms and country estates. Some of these books were purchased legitimately at auction, but many were simply taken during the confusion of the political transition. The market for Napoleonic memorabilia that developed in the decades following his death created powerful incentives for the continued dispersal of his library. Collectors across Europe and America were willing to pay premium prices for books that could be authenticated as having belonged to the emperor. This demand encouraged not just the sale of genuine volumes, but also the creation of forgeries, as unscrupulous dealers sought to capitalize on the Napoleon cult that emerged in the 1830s and 1840s. The process of authentication proved challenging even for legitimate collectors. Napoleon's habit of annotating his books extensively should have made identification straightforward, but his handwriting was notoriously difficult to read, and he had employed various secretaries and scribes over the years who might have made notes in his volumes. The imperial seals and distinctive bindings could be faked, and many books from Napoleon's era shared similar physical characteristics. By the mid-19th century, entire crates of his books had simply disappeared from the historical record. Titles that had been carefully documented in imperial inventories were no longer traceable. A few resurfaced decades later in private collections, occasionally with his notes still intact, but many remain lost. The disappearance of Napoleon's library was not merely a matter of physical dispersal, but also of deliberate destruction. The Bourbon Restoration government, anxious to erase all traces of the imperial period, actively sought to suppress Napoleonic texts and artifacts. Books from the emperor's collection were sometimes burned in public ceremonies, designed to demonstrate the new regime's rejection of the revolutionary and imperial past. Private collectors, fearing political persecution, sometimes destroyed potentially incriminating volumes rather than risk discovery. The process of documentation breakdown was equally systematic. Imperial inventories were suppressed or destroyed, making it impossible for later scholars to reconstruct the full scope of Napoleon's collection. The librarians who had served the emperor were scattered, and many chose to remain silent about their experiences, rather than risk association with the fallen regime. The institutional memory of the imperial library was deliberately erased, leaving only fragments and rumors. The fate of Napoleon's librarians themselves tells a story of intellectual persecution that parallels the destruction of their collections. Antoine Alexandre Barbier, who had served as the emperor's chief librarian at the Tuileries, found himself unemployed and under suspicion after 1815. Despite his scholarly reputation and decades of service to French intellectual life, he was forced to seek refuge in minor provincial positions, his association with the imperial regime having made him unemployable in Paris. His personal notes and catalogs, which might have provided invaluable information about the organization and contents of Napoleon's library, were confiscated by Bourbon authorities and subsequently lost. Jean-Baptiste Joseph Delambre, the renowned astronomer who had helped organize the scientific sections of the Imperial Library, suffered a similar fate. His correspondence with foreign scholars was scrutinized for evidence of seditious activity, and his access to major libraries was restricted. The international network of intellectual exchange that had flourished under the empire was deliberately dismantled, with scholars who had collaborated with Napoleon's educational and cultural projects finding themselves isolated and suspect. The psychological impact of this intellectual persecution extended far beyond the immediate victims. A generation of French scholars learned to be cautious about their political associations, to avoid research topics that might be construed as sympathetic to the imperial regime, and to distance themselves from the cosmopolitan ideals that had characterized Napoleonic intellectual life. The effect was to create a culture of intellectual timidity that persisted well into the 19th century. The destruction of Napoleon's library also had profound implications for the development of library science itself. The emperor's collection had been organized according to innovative principles that reflected his practical approach to knowledge. Rather than following traditional subject classifications, his librarians had developed systems based on what they called intellectual utility and operational relevance. Books were grouped not by topic, but by their potential usefulness for specific types of decision-making. This approach to library organization anticipated many modern developments in information science. Napoleon's insistence on cross-referencing and his librarians' creation of detailed index systems reflected an understanding of knowledge as a dynamic, interconnected web rather than a static collection of discrete facts. The loss of these organizational innovations represented a significant setback for the development of systematic approaches to information management. The emperor's reading methodology, as revealed through surviving marginalia and contemporary accounts, was equally sophisticated. He had developed what might be called a strategic reading approach, focusing not on comprehensive coverage of subjects, but on the extraction of actionable insights. His notes reveal a mind constantly testing theoretical propositions against practical experience, looking for patterns and principles that could be applied to current challenges. This pragmatic approach to scholarship was reflected in the physical organization of his libraries. Books were not merely stored, but actively deployed as tools for ongoing projects. Volumes relevant to current campaigns or administrative challenges were kept within easy reach, while less immediately useful works were relegated to more distant shelves. The emperor's study resembled a military command center more than a traditional library, with maps, correspondence, and reference works arranged to facilitate rapid consultation during decision-making processes. The international dimension of Napoleon's collecting activities had also created unprecedented networks of scholarly exchange. His agents in major European cities were not merely book dealers, but intellectual ambassadors, reporting on new publications, identifying promising scholars, and facilitating the movement of ideas across national boundaries. The destruction of these networks after 1815 represented a significant loss for European intellectual life, contributing to the nationalization and fragmentation of scholarship that characterized the post-revolutionary period. The emperor's personal relationship with specific authors and texts reveals the depth of his intellectual engagement. His correspondence with living writers like Goethe and Chateaubriand shows a mind capable of sophisticated literary analysis and criticism. His annotations on classical texts demonstrate not just familiarity with ancient sources, but active engagement with their political and philosophical implications. Even works of fiction received serious analytical attention, with Napoleon treating novels and poems as sources of insight into human nature and social dynamics. The practical applications of this literary engagement were evident throughout his career. His administrative reforms drew heavily on his reading of legal and political theory, while his military innovations reflected careful study of historical precedents and strategic principles. The Code Napoleon, his most enduring achievement, was informed by extensive reading in jurisprudence and political philosophy, much of it conducted in the quiet hours of early morning, when the emperor would review legal texts and draft commentary. The loss of Napoleon's annotated legal texts represents a particularly significant gap in our understanding of his intellectual development. His marginal notes on works by Montesquieu, Beccaria, and other legal theorists would have provided invaluable insights into the thinking behind his legal reforms. The few surviving examples suggest a mind capable of synthesizing diverse theoretical approaches into practical solutions, but the full scope of his legal scholarship remains largely unknown. The emperor's scientific interests, reflected in his collection of mathematical and technical works, also suffered from the library's dispersal. His correspondence with leading scientists of his era reveals a genuine understanding of scientific method and a commitment to the practical application of scientific principles. His support for the metric system, his investment in technological innovation, and his promotion of scientific education all reflected this commitment to rational, empirical approaches to governance. The surviving fragments of Napoleon's scientific library suggest interests that range from pure mathematics to applied engineering. His annotated copies of works by Lagrange and Laplace show a mind capable of following complex mathematical arguments, while his collection of technical manuals reveals practical interests in everything from hydraulics to metallurgy. The emperor understood that modern warfare and efficient administration required technological superiority, and his reading habits reflected this understanding. The religious and philosophical dimensions of Napoleon's library have been, perhaps, the most neglected aspect of his intellectual life. His complex relationship with Christianity, his interest in comparative religion, and his philosophical reflections on the nature of power and human nature are all reflected in his reading choices. His collection included not just the standard works of French philosophy, but also texts on Islam, Buddhism, and other religious traditions, suggesting a mind genuinely curious about the foundations of human belief and social organization. Religious authorities played a particularly destructive role in the suppression of Napoleon's library. The Catholic Church, which had suffered under the emperor's reforms and secularization policies, was eager to reclaim religious texts and manuscripts that had been requisitioned for the imperial collection. Many of these works were returned to their original institutions, but others were destroyed as contaminated by their association with the imperial regime. The geographical dispersal of Napoleon's books across Europe made systematic recovery impossible. Volumes seized during the various campaigns and occupations were scattered from Madrid to Moscow, from Stockholm to Naples. Some found their way into institutional libraries, where they were eventually cataloged and preserved. But many ended up in private hands, where they were subject to the whims of individual collectors and the vagaries of inheritance and sale. Scholars still debate what exactly happened. Was the dispersal a deliberate act to erase his intellectual legacy? Or was it just the slow decay that follows any fall from power? The truth likely lies in both. Napoleon's ideas were dangerous in the years after his reign. His writings and the works he read continued to inspire political movements across Europe. Republicans, nationalists, and revolutionaries all looked to the Napoleonic era as a model. Suppressing his intellectual footprint became just as important as silencing his voice. The political implications of Napoleon's library extended far beyond the personal reading habits of a fallen emperor. His collection represented a particular vision of enlightenment and empire that threatened the restored monarchies of Europe. The books he had chosen to read and annotate embodied principles of rational administration, religious tolerance, and legal reform that were fundamentally incompatible with the traditional authority structures that sought to reclaim power after 1815. The influence of Napoleon's intellectual legacy on subsequent revolutionary movements cannot be overstated. His annotated copies of Rousseau and Voltaire became textbooks for liberal conspirators across Europe. His military manuals inspired nationalist uprisings from Greece to Poland. His administrative reforms, documented in the legal and political works he had studied, provided blueprints for modernizing movements in Germany and Italy. The suppression of his library was thus not merely an act of spite, but a practical political necessity for those who sought to maintain the old order. The cult of Napoleon that emerged in the 1830s and 1840s was fed partly by the mystery surrounding his missing books. Romantic writers and political activists created elaborate fantasies about the lost volumes, imagining them as containing secret plans for European liberation or prophetic visions of democratic revolution. The actual contents of Napoleon's library were perhaps less revolutionary than these myths suggested, but the very act of suppression had given them a power they might not otherwise have possessed. The scattered nature of Napoleon's library also reflected the broader fragmentation of European intellectual life in the post-revolutionary period. The cosmopolitan culture that had flourished in the 18th century, with its networks of correspondence and exchange that transcended national boundaries, was replaced by a more nationalist and suspicious approach to ideas and texts. Books that had once circulated freely across Europe now became suspect if they carried the wrong associations or suggested dangerous connections. Even today, efforts to reconstruct Napoleon's full library remain incomplete. There are scattered volumes in French museums, libraries in Britain, and archives in Russia. Some bear marginalia, revealing his private thoughts. Others are lost in plain sight, their true origin forgotten by the time they were reshelved. The modern scholarly effort to reconstruct Napoleon's library has been hampered by the very success of its original dispersal. Volumes that once sat together on imperial shelves are now scattered across continents, their original context lost and their relationships to each other obscured. Digital technology has made it possible to create virtual reconstructions, but these remain incomplete and provisional, subject to constant revision as new volumes are discovered or authenticated. The discovery of Napoleon's books in unexpected places continues to surprise scholars and collectors. A volume of Tacitus with extensive imperial marginalia was found in a monastery library in Bavaria in 1987, having apparently been sold there by a French soldier during the retreat from Moscow. A complete set of the Encyclopédie with Napoleon's personal bookplate was discovered in a private collection in Argentina in 2003. Its presence there unexplained, and its authenticity still debated. The British Library's collection of Napoleonic materials, much of it acquired during the 19th century, represents one of the most significant concentrations of the emperor's books outside of France. But even this collection is incomplete, and many volumes are known only through references in contemporary documents or auction catalogs. The process of identification and authentication continues, with scholars using techniques ranging from handwriting analysis to chemical testing of paper and ink. Russian archives, open to Western researchers only in the 1990s, have yielded unexpected treasures from Napoleon's library. Books taken during the occupation of Moscow in 1812 or acquired through later diplomatic exchanges provide glimpses into the emperor's reading habits during the height of his power. Some volumes show evidence of having been read during the campaign itself, with marginalia that can be dated to specific battles or political crises. The French national collections, despite their obvious importance, represent only a fraction of Napoleon's original library. The process of repatriation that began in the 1960s has succeeded in recovering some significant volumes, but many remain in private hands or foreign institutions. The question of ownership remains contentious, with legitimate claims advanced by multiple parties and complicated by the passage of time and the transformation of political systems. And then, of course, there are the rumors. Among the more curious legends is the idea that a secret cache of Napoleon's annotated books survived in the hands of his loyal supporters, that certain titles were spirited away before the fall of Paris, hidden in country estates or foreign cities. One story claims that a set of personal manuscripts and military volumes were locked in a private vault in Italy, untouched since the 1820s. Another suggests that a box of books vanished during Napoleon's brief return to power in 1815, during the 100 Days, and was never recovered after his final defeat. The legend of the hidden cache has persisted for 2 centuries, fed by occasional discoveries and the romantic appeal of lost treasure. The story usually involves a group of devoted followers who recognized the historical importance of Napoleon's library and took extraordinary measures to preserve it. In some versions, the books were hidden in a secret room beneath a chateau in the Loire Valley. In others, they were smuggled to America by immigrants who hoped to establish a Napoleonic museum in the New World. The Italian vault legend is particularly persistent, perhaps because it involves the Bonaparte's ancestral connections to the peninsula. According to this story, Napoleon's brother Joseph, who had served as King of Spain, arranged for the most valuable volumes to be shipped to a secure location near Rome. The cache supposedly includes not just books, but also personal papers, maps, and even the emperor's own manuscript, attempts at writing history and memoirs. Treasure hunters and amateur historians have spent fortunes searching for these hypothetical collections. In the 1960s, a group of American collectors financed an excavation at a ruined monastery in Corsica, convinced that Napoleon's childhood library had been hidden there during the French Revolution. The dig revealed nothing but medieval pottery and disappointment. Similar expeditions have been mounted in various locations across Europe, all ending in failure, but somehow never quite extinguishing the hope that somewhere, somehow, Napoleon's complete library survives intact. The psychological appeal of these legends reflects a broader human desire to believe that important things are not truly lost, that somewhere the complete record of great minds survives waiting to be discovered. In Napoleon's case, the legends also serve to preserve his intellectual reputation, suggesting that his true thoughts and insights remain hidden rather than scattered or destroyed. The missing library becomes a metaphor for the lost possibilities of his reign, the reforms and achievements that might have been if only he had not overreached. Professional historians have generally dismissed these stories as romantic fantasies, but they continue to investigate credible leads when they arise. The discovery of significant Napoleonic materials in unexpected places has lent some credibility to the possibility that larger caches might exist. The challenge lies in distinguishing between genuine, historical possibilities and the elaborate fabrications that have grown up around the Napoleon legend. There is no hard evidence for these tales, but like much about Napoleon, the line between myth and reality is soft. The man encouraged it. He blurred fact and symbol, action and performance. Even in silence, his books speak of that tension. The absence of Napoleon's library has become almost as significant as its presence once was. The gaps in our knowledge of his reading habits and intellectual development create spaces that have been filled by speculation and imagination. We know that he read voraciously and annotated extensively, but the specific pattern of his intellectual development remains partially hidden. Which books influenced particular decisions? How did his reading habits change over time? What were his private thoughts about the authors he studied? These questions can only be answered partially based on the fragmentary evidence that survives. The symbolic power of the missing library has influenced how we understand Napoleon himself. The image of the emperor surrounded by books, reading by candlelight while his armies marched across Europe, has become central to his legend. But the subsequent disappearance of those books adds a note of tragedy to the story, suggesting that even the most powerful men are ultimately vulnerable to the forces of time and politics. The mystery of Napoleon's library also reflects broader questions about the preservation of intellectual heritage in times of political upheaval. How do we maintain cultural continuity when political systems collapse? What happens to the accumulated wisdom of fallen regimes? The fate of Napoleon's books provides a case study in the fragility of cultural institutions and the importance of deliberate preservation efforts. They remind us that behind the battles, the declarations, the vast maps of Europe, there was always a man reading in the dim light. A man making notes in the margin. A man studying the past in order to master the present. The image of Napoleon as reader challenges some of our assumptions about the nature of power and intelligence. His success was not merely the result of natural genius or military instinct, but also of systematic study and intellectual preparation. The books he chose to read, the notes he made in their margins, and the connections he drew between different authors and ideas were all part of the apparatus of empire. His library was not a retreat from power, but an instrument of power, as carefully constructed and maintained as his armies or his legal codes. The relationship between reading and ruling that Napoleon embodied has few parallels in history. Other great leaders have been scholars, but none combine intellectual curiosity with practical power quite so systematically. His library was not a ceremonial collection designed to impress visitors, but a working resource that informed daily decisions about war, diplomacy, and administration. The marginalia in his books reveal a mind constantly seeking to apply abstract principles to concrete situations. The loss of this library represents more than the dispersal of a personal collection. It symbolizes the destruction of a particular model of enlightened leadership that combined intellectual sophistication with practical power. The books that Napoleon read and annotated were not just his personal property, but part of the cultural infrastructure that supported his vision of rational, efficient government. Their disappearance reflects the broader rejection of that vision by the forces that ultimately defeated him. And now, let the pages close quietly for a moment. Let the flickering candlelight fade. We leave the vanished library behind, though its silence still lingers. The emperor's books, scattered across continents and centuries, continue to speak in whispers. In auction houses and private collections, in forgotten corners of great libraries, and the dusty attics of country houses, volumes that once shaped the course of European history, wait to be rediscovered. Each book carries within its pages not just the words of its original author, but the invisible presence of the man who once read it with such intensity, who filled its margins with his thoughts, who carried it across battlefields and into exile. The story of Napoleon's library is ultimately a story about the fragility of human achievement and the persistence of human curiosity. The empire he built with sword and law crumbled within a generation. But the intellectual foundations he laid continue to influence how we think about power, governance, and the relationship between knowledge and authority. His books, even in their absence, remain monuments to the idea that true power must be grounded in understanding. As we close this chapter on the vanished library, we turn toward a different kind of theater entirely. The world of Napoleon's books was private, intimate, marked by the solitary communion between reader and text. But the emperor was also a master of public performance, a man who understood that power must be displayed as well as exercised. From the quiet contemplation of his study, we now move to the grand spectacle of the imperial court, where every gesture carried meaning and every meal was a carefully orchestrated display of dominance. Ahead lies something altogether different, a scene of splendor and control, of jeweled forks, gold-threaded uniforms, and subtle power games whispered between mouthfuls of roast duck. The same man who spent hours alone with his books also commanded the most elaborate court ceremonies in European history, transforming even the simple act of eating into a complex ritual of hierarchy and submission. Let us now enter the dining halls of the Tuileries Palace, where loyalty was measured not in battles, but in glances, etiquette, and who got to sit where. Here, in the glittering world of imperial protocol, Napoleon's genius for control found its most refined expression, and the lessons learned from ancient texts were applied to the timeless art of managing men through spectacle, ceremony, and the careful choreography of social interaction. Even the quietest revolutions eventually hunger for ceremony. And by the time Napoleon had crowned himself emperor, the French court had transformed once again into a place of silk, silver, and subtle theater. Though the monarchy had fallen in fire, the new empire took shape in candlelight and etiquette, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the dining halls of the Tuileries Palace. The palace itself stood in the heart of Paris, flanked by gardens, courtyards, and colonnades. Though originally built by Catherine de' Medici in the 16th century, it had been modified and repurposed by each regime that followed. Under Napoleon, it was both residence and stage. The stone walls echoed with ministers' footsteps, couriers' whispers, and the careful arrangements of an empire that could not afford a single misstep. The transformation of the Tuileries under Napoleon's rule was as deliberate as any military campaign. Where Marie Antoinette had once hosted glittering salons filled with aristocratic frivolity, Napoleon created something far more purposeful. The same rooms that had witnessed the last gasps of the Ancien Regime now served as theaters of imperial power. Portraits of ancient Roman emperors replaced paintings of pastoral scenes. Classical columns were emphasized over Rococo flourishes. Even the furniture spoke of authority rather than comfort, with straight lines and imperial eagles carved into chairbacks and table legs. The palace's daily rhythm began before dawn. Servants moved through corridors like a well-rehearsed orchestra, each knowing their precise role in the day's performance. The head butler, usually a man who had served multiple regimes and survived each transition through careful neutrality, oversaw the preparation of the dining halls with military precision. Silver was polished until it gleamed like mirrors. Crystal glasses were inspected for the smallest imperfection. The finest porcelain, much of it salvaged from the royal collections and repurposed with new imperial symbols, was arranged according to protocols that had evolved from centuries of French court tradition. Yet beneath this surface of renewed grandeur lay the tension of a society still finding its footing. The revolution had not merely changed who held power. It had fundamentally altered how power could be held. Napoleon's courtiers included men who had risen from nothing, alongside those who had hidden their noble birth during the Terror. Former revolutionaries sat beside former emigres who had only recently returned from exile. The very concept of legitimacy remained fluid, uncertain, dependent on Napoleon's continued success rather than ancient bloodlines or divine appointment. Dinner at the Tuileries was never just about food. It was a performance. Each guest, each plate, each minute of the evening unfolded with precise choreography. Seating arrangements were a political language of their own. To be invited was a statement of favor. To be seated too far from the emperor was a quiet warning. To be excluded altogether was often the beginning of exile. The invitations themselves carried weight beyond their elegant script. They were written on paper bearing the imperial seal, delivered by liveried footmen who moved through Paris like emissaries of power. Recipients understood that accepting meant more than enjoying a fine meal. It meant participating in the ongoing creation of imperial culture. To decline without exceptional cause was to risk being forgotten, and in Napoleon's court, to be forgotten was to cease to exist politically. The guest list for any given evening reflected the empire's complex needs. There might be marshals still dusty from campaigns in Spain or Austria, their uniforms bearing the marks of recent battles. Diplomats from allied or conquered nations would appear in their finest court dress, their smiles carefully calibrated to suggest neither subservience nor defiance. Members of the new imperial nobility, men who had earned their titles through service rather than birth, would sit alongside remnants of the old aristocracy who had made their peace with the new order. Women at these dinners occupied a particularly delicate position. The revolution had promised equality, but the empire had restored many traditional hierarchies. Ladies of the court moved through the evening like players in an elaborate chess game, their conversations monitored for political undertones, their alliances scrutinized for signs of faction. They wore gowns that balanced imperial fashion with personal taste, knowing that appearing too modest might suggest lack of appreciation for imperial grandeur, while dressing too extravagantly could be seen as competing with the empress herself. Imagine the room just before the meal began. High ceilings painted with mythological scenes, gilded chandeliers dripping with candlelight, marble floors buffed to a soft sheen. Courtiers in finely tailored uniforms stood at attention, their gloved hands behind their backs, while liveried servants moved like ghosts between settings of porcelain and polished crystal. The dining hall itself was a masterpiece of calculated intimidation. The ceiling bore frescoes depicting the triumph of order over chaos, with allegorical figures representing justice, victory, and imperial glory looking down upon the diners below. The walls, covered in silk wallpaper of deep imperial blue, were hung with mirrors that multiplied the candlelight and created an illusion of infinite space. These mirrors served a practical purpose beyond mere decoration. They allowed Napoleon to observe his guests' reactions and private conversations from multiple angles without appearing to do so. The table was a marvel of engineering as much as artistry. Carved from a single piece of mahogany and capable of seating 40 guests, it was set with such precision that the distance between each place setting was measured to the millimeter. The centerpiece varied with the seasons and the political moment. During periods of military triumph, it might feature miniature cannons cast in silver and bronze. When diplomatic relations required delicate handling, arrangements of exotic flowers from territories within the French sphere of influence would bloom in crystal vases. The message was always clear. The empire's reach was vast, its resources boundless, its power absolute. Each place setting told its own story. The plates, bearing the imperial eagle, were arranged in perfect alignment. Multiple sets of silverware flanked each setting, their placement dictating the evening's progression through various courses. Wine glasses of different sizes and shapes awaited the carefully selected vintages that would accompany each dish. Even the napkins, folded in the imperial style and bearing subtle embroidered insignia, served as reminders of the ordered hierarchy that governed every aspect of court life. The servants who prepared these settings were themselves part of the palace's complex social ecosystem. Many had served the previous royal court and had adapted their skills to the new regime's requirements. They moved with practiced silence, their faces masks of professional neutrality. They had learned to see nothing, hear nothing, and remember nothing beyond their immediate duties. In a world where a misplaced word could lead to exile, or worse, invisibility was a survival skill. The meal began with the emperor's arrival. Napoleon did not enjoy long dinners, but he understood their purpose. He would enter quietly, nod once to the room, and take his place without flourish. Everyone else followed. Conversation was formal, careful. Only certain topics were acceptable, and only some were invited to speak. A single glance from Napoleon could still a table. Napoleon's entrance was choreographed to appear spontaneous while being entirely calculated. He would often arrive precisely 15 minutes after the appointed hour, long enough to ensure all guests were present and properly anxious, short enough to avoid any appearance of theatrical excess. His dress was invariably simple compared to those around him. A dark coat, minimal decoration, perhaps a single order of merit pinned to his chest. This simplicity was itself a statement of power. Only a man absolutely secure in his authority could afford to appear modest among such splendor. The emperor's physical presence dominated the room despite his relatively small stature. His piercing gaze would sweep the assembled company, cataloging faces, noting absences, measuring the subtle shifts in posture that revealed political currents. He had cultivated the ability to make each person feel simultaneously observed and ignored, important and insignificant. This psychological mastery was as crucial to his power as any military victory. When Napoleon took his seat, the complex ritual of imperial dining began. The first course was always served simultaneously to all guests, a logistical marvel that required split-second timing from dozens of servants. The emperor would lift his fork, and only then would others begin eating. He ate quickly, efficiently, often finishing each course while others were still beginning. This habit, formed during years of campaign dining, had the effect of keeping the entire table on edge, uncertain how long they would have to enjoy each dish. The conversation during these meals was an art form in itself. Topics were introduced obliquely, tested for imperial reaction, then either developed or abandoned based on Napoleon's responses. Military matters were discussed in terms of strategy and logistics rather than casualties and hardship. Economic policies were praised for their wisdom and effectiveness. Cultural achievements were celebrated as evidence of imperial enlightenment. The darker aspects of rule, the necessary compromises and harsh decisions, were spoken of only in the most abstract terms, if at all. Those skilled in court conversation learned to read the emperor's moods through the smallest gestures. A slight nod might indicate approval for a particular line of discussion. A pause before responding could signal displeasure. The way Napoleon held his wine glass, the frequency with which he consulted his watch, the direction of his gaze all carried meaning for those who knew how to interpret them. The food was exceptional, of course. Chefs trained in the finest kitchens of France prepared multiple courses with ingredients sourced from across the empire. There might be roasted duck with cherries, veal braised in wine, or delicate fish wrapped in pastry. Vegetables were arranged in symmetrical patterns, sauces dripped precisely where they should, and desserts came sculpted like miniature palaces of sugar and cream. The kitchen staff who created these culinary masterpieces worked in conditions that paralleled the court itself. The head chef, invariably a man of considerable reputation, who had survived multiple regime changes, commanded a hierarchy as rigid as any military unit. Sous chefs, pastry specialists, sauce masters, and kitchen assistants all knew their precise roles and executed them with the discipline of soldiers. The slightest error in preparation or presentation could result in immediate dismissal. And in Napoleon's Paris, a cook dismissed from the imperial kitchen would find few doors open to him elsewhere. The ingredients themselves were carefully selected not just for quality, but for their symbolic value. Wines from recently conquered territories appeared on the imperial table as liquid trophies of victory. Exotic spices from distant colonies demonstrated the empire's global reach. Even the salt was significant, coming from the royal salt works that had been appropriated by the state and transformed into imperial monopolies. Each course was designed to tell a story. The soup course might feature a rich consomme that spoke of abundance and plenty. Fish dishes, often prepared in classical French styles, honored tradition while incorporating new techniques that suggested innovation and progress. Meat courses celebrated the bounty of the French countryside while demonstrating the refinement of imperial taste. The wine pairings were selected not just for their complementary flavors, but for their regional significance, their vintage years marking important moments in the empire's history. The presentation of each dish was as important as its taste. Plates were warmed to precise temperatures. Garnishes were arranged with mathematical precision. Sauces were applied with the skill of artists, creating patterns that pleased the eye while enhancing the flavors. The serving staff moved with balletic grace, appearing at the exact moment each course was ready to be enjoyed, disappearing just as silently once their task was complete. But even the finest meal could not erase the tension beneath the surface. The palace glittered, but the foundation of Napoleon's empire rested on constant vigilance. Everyone at that table knew their place could vanish with a shift in political wind. Officers, nobles, diplomats, and ministers sat side by side, some with new titles granted by imperial favor, others with old names reclaimed and repurposed for a new regime. Many of these men had survived the revolution. They had seen guillotines fall and republics collapse. They smiled now carefully, aware of every word they said. The psychological strain of maintaining perfect composure throughout these lengthy dinners was enormous. Guests had learned to control not just their words, but their facial expressions, their posture, even the rhythm of their breathing. A moment of inattention, a gesture that could be misinterpreted, a laugh that rang too loudly or died too quickly, all could be noted and remembered. The imperial court had developed its own language of subtle signals, where a raised eyebrow might convey volumes, and a carefully timed pause could alter the course of a conversation. The seating arrangements themselves were exercises in psychological warfare. Napoleon's favorites found themselves within easy conversation distance of the emperor, able to catch his attention with a well-timed remark or observation. Those currently out of favor were seated farther away, forced to speak more loudly if they wished to be heard, making their attempts at ingratiation more obvious, and therefore more humiliating. The middle distances of the table were occupied by those whose status was uncertain, men walking diplomatic tightropes who might find themselves promoted or demoted based on their performance during a single evening. The conversation flowed in carefully controlled channels. Military officers spoke of tactics and strategy, their words carrying the weight of recent victories and the shadows of future campaigns. Diplomats discussed international relations and terms, so veiled that their true meanings were clear only to those thoroughly versed in the complexities of European politics. Ministers reported on domestic policies and administrative reforms, their statistics and achievements presented as evidence of imperial wisdom and efficiency. Even Josephine, Napoleon's first wife and empress, had to navigate the currents of courtly life with caution. Though she possessed grace and warmth, her position was never entirely secure. Rumors of divorce and questions about heirs floated through the halls like the scent of wine and lavender. When she hosted, she did so with elegance, but behind her charm was a sharp understanding of courtly survival. Josephine's presence at these dinners added another layer of complexity to the evening's dynamics. As empress, she held the highest rank among the women present, Yet her influence was always indirect, exercised through charm rather than authority. She had mastered the art of appearing to be above the political machinations that swirled around her while actually being acutely aware of every shift in the balance of power. Her conversation was a masterclass in diplomatic grace. She could discuss fashion with the wives of foreign ambassadors in terms that subtly reinforced French cultural superiority. She could inquire about the health of various courtiers' families in ways that demonstrated both imperial benevolence and intimate knowledge of their personal circumstances. Her laughter, when it came, was perfectly calibrated to encourage without seeming to take sides, to acknowledge wit without appearing to endorse any particular political position. The Empress's wardrobe for these occasions was itself a form of political communication. Her gowns, created by the finest designers in Paris, set trends that would be copied throughout Europe. The colors she chose, the jewels she wore, even the way she arranged her hair, sent messages about imperial taste and French refinement. Foreign guests would study her appearance with the intensity of diplomats reading treaties, knowing that every detail would be reported back to their home courts. Yet beneath this surface of imperial grandeur, Josephine lived with the constant awareness of her precarious position. The question of succession haunted the empire, and her failure to provide Napoleon with an heir created a vulnerability that her enemies at court were always ready to exploit. She had learned to deflect inquiries about children with grace, to turn conversation toward other topics without appearing to avoid the subject, to maintain her dignity while acknowledging the limitations of her situation. The other women at these dinners occupied positions that were equally complex, but differently constrained. The wives of marshals and ministers had to balance their loyalty to their husbands' careers with their own social ambitions. They moved through the evening like skilled diplomats, building alliances, gathering information, and positioning themselves advantageously for future opportunities. Their conversations were filled with seemingly casual inquiries about family connections, business interests, and social obligations that were actually sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations. There were unwritten rules. One did not drink too fast. One did not speak over others. One certainly did not mention the revolution, the Directory, or anything that might recall instability. Instead, conversation turned toward art, music, hunting, and travel. If Napoleon offered a comment or a joke, it was met with the lightest laughter, never too loud, never too eager. The topics that were forbidden at these dinners were as significant as those that were encouraged. Any reference to the executed king and queen was absolutely taboo. The period of the Terror could not be discussed, even obliquely. The various political factions that had risen and fallen during the revolutionary period were not to be mentioned. Even the word republic was avoided, as it carried implications of alternative forms of government that might challenge imperial authority. Instead, conversation focused on subjects that reinforced the stability and permanence of the current order. Art and literature were safe topics, particularly when they celebrated classical themes or imperial achievements. Music could be discussed as long as it emphasized harmony and order rather than revolution or change. Fashion was always acceptable, as it demonstrated prosperity and refinement without challenging political authority. Hunting was a particularly favored topic, as it allowed military officers to display their knowledge of strategy and tactics in a non-threatening context. Stories of successful hunts could be told as metaphors for military campaigns, with Napoleon himself often participating in these discussions with evident pleasure. The imperial hunts were elaborate affairs that served as both recreation and political theater, opportunities for the emperor to demonstrate his energy and skill while building camaraderie with his officers. Travel was another safe subject, particularly when it involved territories within the French sphere of influence. Guests could share their experiences of different regions, their observations of local customs, their assessments of economic conditions, and political stability. These conversations served multiple purposes, providing entertainment while also giving Napoleon valuable intelligence about the conditions in distant parts of his empire. The art of responding to Napoleon's occasional comments and jokes required the highest level of social skill. His humor was often dry and could be interpreted in multiple ways. A joke that seemed to mock a particular individual might actually be a test of that person's ability to handle criticism gracefully. A comment that appeared to praise one policy might actually be an invitation to critique another. The courtiers who survived and thrived in this environment were those who could read these subtle signals and respond appropriately. The timing of laughter was crucial. Too quick a response might suggest sycophancy, while too slow a reaction could imply lack of appreciation for imperial wit. The volume and duration of laughter had to be carefully calibrated to match the emperor's mood and the nature of his comment. A genuine laugh from Napoleon was rare and precious, a sign that he was relaxed and enjoying the company. But even these moments required careful handling to avoid overstepping boundaries. Yet even in this polished world, hints of power were everywhere. The imperial guards stationed just beyond the door, the subtle gestures from aides who hovered nearby, the silence that followed if Napoleon put down his fork. The physical reminders of imperial power were woven throughout the dining experience. The guards outside the doors were visible through the glass panels, their uniforms and weapons serving as constant reminders of the force that underpinned all the evening's elegance. These men, selected for their loyalty as much as their skill, represented the military foundation upon which the entire imperial structure rested. The aides who moved silently through the room during the meal served multiple functions. They carried messages between the emperor and his ministers, allowing for the conduct of state business, even during social occasions. They observed the interactions between guests, noting alliances and tensions that might require imperial attention. They also served as subtle intimidators, their presence reminding everyone that the emperor's reach extended into every corner of the room. The protocol surrounding Napoleon's own behavior at these dinners was elaborate and meaningful. When he put down his fork, it signaled that he was finished with a particular course, and servants would begin clearing the table. When he pushed back his chair, it indicated that the formal dining portion of the evening was concluded. When he rose from his seat, everyone else was expected to rise as well, ready to follow his lead to the next phase of the evening's activities. These physical cues were supplemented by verbal signals that were equally important. Napoleon's tone of voice could indicate whether a conversation was welcome or should be concluded. His posture, the direction of his gaze, even the way he held his hands all carried meaning for those who knew how to read them. The courtiers who succeeded in this environment were those who could interpret these signals correctly and respond appropriately. The emperor's famous habit of taking snuff during these dinners was itself a form of communication. The particular snuff box he chose, the frequency with which he used it, the way he offered it to others, all carried significance. A shared pinch of snuff was a sign of imperial favor, a moment of intimacy that could elevate a courtier's status in the eyes of others. The refusal of such an offer, while not necessarily indicating displeasure, was noted and remembered. After the meal, guests often moved to adjoining salons where music played. Cigars were passed, and delicate glasses of liqueur were sipped in low conversation. Musicians played soft pieces by Mozart, Haydn, or newer composers favored by the court. Napoleon rarely stayed long. He preferred to return to his private quarters, where maps, letters, and strategy awaited. The transition from the formal dining room to the more intimate salons marked a shift in the evening's dynamics. The rigid protocol of the dinner table gave way to a more relaxed atmosphere, though one that was still carefully controlled and monitored. The salons themselves were arranged to facilitate different types of conversation, with comfortable seating groups that encouraged intimate discussion while maintaining clear sight lines that prevented any truly private conversations. The music selection for these post-dinner gatherings was as carefully curated as the menu had been. Classical pieces that emphasized harmony and order were favored, with compositions that were complex enough to demonstrate imperial sophistication, but not so challenging as to distract from conversation. The musicians themselves were skilled professionals who had learned to gauge the mood of the room and adjust their performance accordingly, fading into the background when serious discussions began, providing gentle accompaniment when lighter conversation was desired. Distribution of cigars and liqueurs followed its own protocol. The finest cigars, often from Caribbean territories under French influence, were offered first to Napoleon and then to guests in order of their proximity to imperial favor. The liqueurs, many of them produced in monasteries and distilleries that had been nationalized during the Revolution and were now operated as imperial monopolies, were served in crystal glasses that bore the imperial seal. These smaller gatherings allowed for more personal interactions, opportunities for individual courtiers to catch the emperor's attention with particularly insightful observations or useful information. The conversations that took place in these salons often had more immediate political significance than the formal dinner discussions, as they provided opportunities for the kind of direct, personal communication that could influence policy decisions. However, Napoleon's early departure from these gatherings was itself a calculated political move. By leaving while the evening was still in progress, he demonstrated that his time was precious and that affairs of state took precedence over social pleasures. His absence also allowed the remaining guests to relax slightly, to speak more freely among themselves, conversations that were often reported back to him by trusted observers who remained behind. The courtiers remained, keeping up appearances, gently testing alliances, and quietly watching one another. Deals were not made outright in these rooms, but relationships were maintained. Support was measured in nods, shared glances, and in knowing when to leave a conversation before it turned too bold. The social dynamics of these post-dinner gatherings were complex and multi-layered. With the emperor's departure, the rigid hierarchy of the dinner table gave way to a more fluid social structure, though one that was still carefully regulated by unspoken rules and expectations. The senior courtiers who remained often found themselves in positions of temporary authority, able to guide conversations and influence the opinions of their junior colleagues. The art of alliance building in these settings required extraordinary subtlety. Direct propositions were never made, but mutual interests were explored through seemingly casual conversations about family connections, business opportunities, and social obligations. A discussion of one's children's education might actually be an inquiry about potential marriage alliances. A conversation about investment opportunities could be a way of gauging financial resources and political reliability. The physical arrangement of these salons facilitated different types of interaction. Intimate seating areas allowed for private conversations between small groups, while larger open spaces enabled more general discussions that included multiple participants. The skilled courtier learned to move between these different settings as the evening progressed, gathering information in one location, sharing insights in another, building relationships through a series of carefully orchestrated encounters. The servants who maintained these rooms throughout the evening were skilled in their own form of discretion. They could refresh drinks and empty ashtrays while appearing to be completely oblivious to the conversations taking place around them. They had learned to time their movements to avoid interrupting sensitive discussions, to position themselves so as not to overhear private conversations, and to maintain the kind of invisible presence that allowed the guests to feel they were truly alone. The games that were sometimes played in these salons were themselves forms of political communication. Card games provided opportunities for displaying skill and nerve, while engaging in the kind of casual conversation that could reveal political opinions and personal relationships. The stakes were usually modest, but the way individuals played, their willingness to take risks, their behavior in victory and defeat, all provided insights into their characters that could be politically useful. And then the evening would end. Candles were snuffed, chairs pushed back. Servants cleaned the silver, scrubbed the plates, and reset the long dining table for the next display. By morning, the polished veneer of calm would return. But beneath the golden trim and velvet cushions, the pressure of imperial rule remained. The conclusion of these imperial dinners was as carefully choreographed as their beginning. Guests departed in order of precedence, with the most senior courtiers leaving first, followed by those of progressively lower rank. The timing of one's departure was itself a form of political communication. Leaving too early might suggest lack of appreciation for imperial hospitality, while staying too late could appear presumptuous or indicate that one had nowhere else important to be. The carriages that waited outside the palace to convey guests home were themselves symbols of status and wealth. The finest equipages, with their liveried drivers and perfectly matched horses, belonged to those who had profited most from imperial favor. The more modest conveyances reflected the financial constraints of those who maintained their positions through merit rather than accumulated wealth. The conversations that took place during these carriage rides home were often the most honest of the entire evening. Freed from the immediate presence of imperial surveillance, guests could finally express their true opinions about the evening's events, though even these discussions were conducted with considerable caution. The walls of Paris had ears, and careless words spoken in private could easily find their way back to the imperial court. The servants who cleaned up after these elaborate dinners worked through the night to prepare for the next day's activities. The silver was polished and stored in locked cabinets. The crystal was washed and carefully packed away. The linens were sent to the palace laundry, where they would be cleaned and pressed according to exacting standards. The dining room itself was swept and mopped, its marble floors restored to their perfect shine. The kitchen staff faced their own complex cleanup operations. The specialized pots and pans used for different courses had to be thoroughly cleaned and properly stored. The leftover food, still of exceptional quality, was distributed according to strict protocols, with the choicest portions going to senior servants and the remainder being distributed among the palace staff according to their rank and responsibilities. The head of household staff would conduct a thorough review of the evening's events, noting any problems or irregularities that needed to be addressed. Service that had been less than perfect would be critiqued and improved. Staff members who had performed exceptionally well would be noted for potential advancement. The entire operation would be analyzed and refined, ensuring that future dinners would be even more successful. In a world where loyalty was rewarded with titles and disloyalty with silence, every dinner was a quiet contest, a performance of unity under chandeliers. And in that glow, the emperor watched everything. The imperial dining room, once emptied of its guests, took on an entirely different character. The absence of conversation revealed the subtle sounds that had been masked during the evening. The ticking of ornate clocks, the settling of wooden furniture, the distant sounds of the city beyond the palace walls. These quiet moments between performances were perhaps the most honest, when the room revealed its true nature as a stage set rather than a genuine home. The chandeliers, their candles now extinguished, cast strange shadows in the moonlight that filtered through the tall windows. The portraits of Roman emperors and French kings gazed down upon empty chairs, their painted eyes seeming to judge the evening's performance. The mirrors that had multiplied the candlelight now reflected only darkness, their surfaces catching occasional glimpses of the guards who patrolled the corridors beyond. The very air in the room seemed to hold the memory of the evening's tensions. The carefully controlled conversations, the measured laughter, the constant awareness of being watched and judged, all had left their mark on the space. The room had absorbed the hopes and fears of those who had dined there, the ambitions and anxieties that had been hidden beneath the surface of polite discourse. The dining table itself, now cleared of its elaborate place settings, stood as a monument to the evening's complex choreography. Each chair had been occupied by someone whose fate depended, at least partially, on their performance during the preceding hours. The emperor's chair, slightly larger and more ornate than the others, remained a symbol of the absolute power that had presided over every moment of the evening. Now let that glitter dim. Let the echo of footsteps on marble fade away. The table has been cleared. The halls are empty again. But the silence that now filled the Tuileries was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a mechanism temporarily at rest, gathering energy for the next performance. The palace breathed quietly in the darkness, its rooms holding their secrets close. The courtiers who had departed carried with them the memories of the evening, the subtle messages they had received, the impressions they had formed of their fellow guests' loyalties and ambitions. In his private chambers, Napoleon might still be awake, reviewing the evening's events with the same analytical precision he brought to military campaigns. He would remember who had spoken and who had remained silent, who had seemed nervous and who had appeared confident, who had sought his attention and who had seemed to avoid it. These observations would be filed away in his remarkable memory, to be retrieved when future decisions about appointments, promotions, or punishments needed to be made. The palace guards continued their patrols, their footsteps echoing through corridors that had witnessed the rise and fall of multiple regimes. They were the physical embodiment of the force that made all the evening's elegance possible, the steel beneath the silk that ensured the empire's continued existence. Their presence was a reminder that beneath all the ceremony and protocol, power ultimately rested on the ability to compel obedience through fear as much as through favor. We've walked tonight through muddy battlefields, distant islands, forgotten libraries, and golden dining rooms. Each place showed us a different face of Napoleon's world. Each piece mattered, and each carried its own quiet burdens. The journey through these different spaces had revealed the complexity of imperial power, the way it manifested itself in different forms, depending on the context and the audience. The battlefield had shown power as raw force, the ability to compel through violence, and the threat of violence. The island had revealed power as isolation, the capacity to remove oneself from the ordinary constraints of society. The library had demonstrated power as knowledge, the ability to shape understanding and control information. But the dining room had shown perhaps the most subtle and sophisticated form of power, the ability to create a reality so compelling that people willingly participated in their own subordination. The courtiers who had gathered that evening had not been forced to attend at gunpoint. They had come willingly, eagerly, because they understood that their own survival and prosperity depended on their successful performance in this elaborate theater. The dining room had been a space where power was both displayed and concealed, where the emperor's absolute authority was demonstrated through the very fact that it did not need to be explicitly asserted. The elaborate protocol, the careful choreography, the constant awareness of being watched and judged, all served to reinforce the existing order without the need for overt threats or displays of force. Yet the dining room had also revealed the fragility of this power, the way it depended on the continued consent and cooperation of those who participated in its rituals. The courtiers who had smiled and nodded and laughed at the emperor's jokes had done so because they chose to, because they believed that their interests were best served by maintaining the existing order. But that choice could be withdrawn. Those smiles could fade, and the entire elaborate structure could collapse as quickly as it had been built. Let's close now with a final reflection. A gentle step back into the present, where no one demands we march at dawn. The echoes of that imperial dining room seem to fade as we return to our own time, yet something of its atmosphere lingers. The careful balance of power and protocol, the way individual ambition meshes with collective performance, the understanding that every social interaction carries political weight, these elements have not disappeared from the world. They have simply taken new forms, found new venues, adapted to new circumstances. The Tuileries Palace itself was destroyed in 1871 during the Paris Commune, its rooms and corridors reduced to rubble and ash. The elaborate dining room where Napoleon had once held court exists now only in memory and historical record. The guests who once gathered there, the servants who prepared their meals, the musicians who provided their entertainment, all have long since passed into history. But the patterns of power they embodied, the techniques of control and influence they perfected, the delicate balance between authority and consent they maintained, these continue to shape our world in ways both obvious and subtle. The next time we find ourselves in any gathering where hierarchy matters, where status is displayed and deference is expected, we might remember that imperial dining room and recognize the echoes of its elaborate choreography. The lessons of that glittering chamber extend beyond the realm of politics into every area of human interaction where power is exercised and influence is sought. The businessman entertaining clients, the academic hosting colleagues, the social leader gathering supporters, all employ techniques that Napoleon would have recognized and perhaps admired. The venues may be different, the stakes may be lower, but the fundamental dynamics remain remarkably consistent. And perhaps that consistency reveals something profound about human nature itself, about our need for hierarchy and order, our desire for recognition and status, our willingness to participate in elaborate performances if the rewards are sufficient. The imperial dining room was not just a historical curiosity, but a window into the eternal human struggle between individual ambition and collective order, between the desire for freedom and the need for security, between the dream of equality and the reality of power. As we prepare to leave this vanished world of silk and silver, of careful protocol and dangerous ambition, we might pause to consider what other spaces of power await our exploration. What other venues where history was shaped by the subtle interplay of personality and politics, where the fate of nations was decided over carefully prepared meals and artfully arranged conversations. The imperial dining room was just one such space, but it was not the only one, and the patterns it revealed continue to echo through the chambers of power wherever they may be found. The story of power is never complete, never finished, always evolving and adapting to new circumstances. The next chapter in this exploration might take us to very different places, to spaces where power wore different masks and spoke in different voices. But the fundamental questions would remain the same. How is authority established and maintained? How do individuals navigate the complex hierarchies that shape their lives? How do societies balance the competing demands of order and freedom, security and justice, tradition and change? These questions, first posed in the candlelit dining rooms of the Tuileries, continue to demand our attention and our answers. The imperial dining room had been more than just a space for consumption. It had been a laboratory for the study of human nature under pressure. Every evening had been an experiment in social control, a test of how far individuals could be pushed to suppress their natural impulses in service of a larger performance. The guests who had gathered, there had been both actors and audience, performers and critics, each playing multiple roles simultaneously while maintaining the illusion that they were simply enjoying a pleasant meal. The psychological sophistication of Napoleon's court rivaled that of any modern institution. The emperor and his advisors had understood intuitively what social scientists would later formalize, that human behavior could be shaped and controlled through careful manipulation of environment, expectation, and reward. The dining room had been designed to maximize compliance and minimize resistance, to create conditions where dissent seemed not just dangerous, but almost unthinkable. The wine served at these dinners deserves particular attention, as it played a crucial role in the evening's dynamics. The selection was always politically significant, with vintages chosen to send specific messages about the empire's reach and sophistication. Bottled from a recently conquered territory, served as a liquid reminder of French military prowess. A rare vintage from a traditional, wine-producing region demonstrated the empire's respect for established quality and tradition. The timing of when particular wines were served could indicate the emperor's mood and his assessment of the evening's progress. The sommelier who oversaw these selections held a position of considerable influence, though one that was never officially acknowledged. His understanding of wine had to be matched by an equally sophisticated grasp of politics, as a poorly chosen bottle could send the wrong message or create unfortunate associations. Temperature at which wines were served, the glasses in which they were presented, even the manner in which they were poured all contributed to the evening's overall effect. The relationship between alcohol and power in these settings was complex and carefully managed. Wine could loosen tongues and reveal true opinions, but it could also create opportunities for indiscretion that might be politically damaging. The skilled courtier learned to maintain perfect control even while appearing to relax, to seem affected by the wine while actually remaining completely alert to every nuance of conversation and behavior around the table. Napoleon himself was known for his moderation in drinking, a habit that gave him a significant advantage over guests who might be more susceptible to alcohol's effects. His apparent temperance was itself a form of power play, demonstrating his superior self-control while creating opportunities to observe others when their guards might be lowered. The emperor's water glass was always kept full, and he would often raise it in toasts while actually consuming very little of the wine being celebrated. The seasonal variations in these dinners reflected the empire's agricultural rhythms and political calendar. Spring meals featured the first vegetables and fruits of the year, symbolizing renewal and the promise of prosperity. Summer dinners showcased the abundance of the French countryside, with elaborate displays of produce that demonstrated the empire's agricultural success. Autumn meals celebrated the harvest and the cycle of natural abundance, while winter dinners emphasized the palace's ability to provide luxury and comfort even in the darkest months. These seasonal themes were not merely decorative. They served important political functions. The ability to provide fresh, high-quality food throughout the year was a demonstration of administrative competence and economic stability. The elaborate preparations required for these seasonal celebrations employed hundreds of workers, from farmers and suppliers to cooks and servants, creating a complex network of economic dependence that reinforced the empire's political structure. The flowers that adorned these dining rooms were selected with the same care as the food and wine. Arrangements might feature blooms from the imperial gardens, demonstrating the palace's horticultural sophistication, or exotic species imported from distant territories, showcasing the empire's global reach. The colors chosen for these floral displays could reinforce the evening's political themes, with imperial purple and gold predominating during particularly formal occasions, while more subdued arrangements might accompany dinners focused on diplomatic delicacy. The language spoken during these dinners was itself a form of political communication. While French was the official language of the court, Napoleon himself was more comfortable with Italian, and many of his marshals spoke with regional accents that reflected their humble origins. The choice of language for particular conversations could indicate levels of intimacy, political alignment, or intended audience. A shift from French to Italian might signal a more personal conversation, while the use of formal diplomatic language could indicate that a discussion was intended for a broader audience. The empire's multilingual character was reflected in the diverse backgrounds of those who attended these dinners. Former enemies who had become allies, representatives of conquered territories who had accepted French rule, diplomats from distant courts who spoke multiple languages fluently, all contributed to a linguistic complexity that mirrored the empire's political diversity. The ability to navigate these linguistic subtleties was essential for anyone hoping to succeed in Napoleon's court. The medical aspects of these elaborate dinners were also carefully managed. The imperial physician was always present, though discreetly positioned where he could observe without intruding. The risk of poisoning was a constant concern, and elaborate precautions were taken to ensure the safety of the food and drink. Tasters were employed, though their role was disguised as part of the normal service protocol. The physician's presence also served a broader function, as he could observe the health and behavior of important guests. providing the emperor with valuable intelligence about potential weaknesses or concerns. The emperor's own health was a matter of state security, and his eating habits were carefully monitored and controlled. His preference for simple foods, his tendency to eat quickly, and his frequent complaints of stomach ailments were all factors that influenced the planning and execution of these dinners. The kitchen staff had to balance the need for impressive presentations with the emperor's personal dietary requirements, creating menus that satisfied both political and medical concerns. The waste generated by these elaborate dinners was itself a form of political statement. The quantity of food prepared far exceeded what could be consumed, and the disposal of leftovers followed strict protocols. The finest remainders were distributed to senior servants and palace staff, while lesser portions were sent to local charitable institutions. This system of distribution reinforced social hierarchies while also demonstrating imperial benevolence, turning even waste into an opportunity for political messaging. The economic impact of these dinners extended far beyond the palace walls. The demand for luxury goods created opportunities for merchants, artisans, and producers throughout the empire. The finest wines, the most exotic spices, the most elegant tableware, all had to be sourced, transported, and prepared, creating a complex supply chain that employed thousands of people. The imperial court's consumption patterns influenced fashion and taste throughout French society, as provincial nobles and wealthy merchants sought to emulate the styles and preferences displayed at these gatherings. The intelligence value of these dinners was enormous. Every conversation was potentially significant. Every interaction could reveal important information about political alliances, military capabilities, or economic conditions. The emperor's spies and informants were present throughout the evening, some openly acknowledged as members of the court, others operating under various covers. The information gathered during these social occasions often proved as valuable as that obtained through more conventional intelligence operations. The archives of the imperial court contain detailed records of these dinners, including guest lists, seating arrangements, menu selections, and summaries of significant conversations. These documents were carefully preserved and regularly consulted, creating a comprehensive database of political and social intelligence that could be used to guide future policy decisions. The record keeping was so meticulous that historians today can reconstruct not just what was served at particular dinners, but also who said what to whom and how the emperor reacted to various developments. The legacy of these imperial dinners extended far beyond Napoleon's reign. The protocols developed during this period influenced court ceremonies throughout Europe for generations. The emphasis on combining political messaging with social entertainment became a standard feature of diplomatic life. The techniques of social control and influence pioneered in the Tuileries dining room were studied and adapted by subsequent rulers, creating a tradition of power that persisted long after the empire itself had fallen. The destruction of the Tuileries Palace in 1871 marked the end of an era, but the patterns of behavior established during Napoleon's reign continued to influence French political culture. The importance of protocol, the careful attention to symbolic details, the understanding that every social interaction carries political weight, these elements became embedded in the French approach to statecraft and remain visible in contemporary diplomatic practice. As we prepare to leave this world of calculated elegance and dangerous ambition, we carry with us an understanding of how power operates in its most sophisticated forms. The imperial dining room was a masterpiece of social engineering, a space where individual will was subsumed into collective performance, where the most basic human activity of sharing food was transformed into an elaborate ritual of dominance and submission. The lessons learned at that glittering table continue to echo through the halls of power wherever they may be found, reminding us that the most effective forms of control are often the most subtle, the most seductive, and the most difficult to resist. And that's where we'll leave it for tonight. From the frozen marshes of nameless soldiers to the sharp rise of a Corsican boy with a restless mind. From the vanished shelves of an emperor's private library to the candlelit glances across polished tables in the Tuileries palace. A long, quiet journey through the worn pages and shadowed corners of Napoleonic history. If you're still awake, thanks for staying with me all the way to the end. And if you drifted off somewhere between the blisters and the roast duck, that's completely fine too. That's kind of the whole point. If you enjoyed this slower, sleep-friendly walk through the past, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it was when you pressed play. I love seeing how far these soft-spoken stories are reaching. For now, I'll let the sound of marching boots fade, the rustle of paper and turning pages fall still, and the golden halls of empire slip quietly back into the dark. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.